Inside a mountain hotel, two people were talking about a rumor concerning a mercenary said to be insane. One asked about this man, since the description going around pointed to a mercenary who didn't value life or money at all. This man fought with no clear goal, no defined purpose, and the most unsettling thing was that he always muttered the same line after every fight, "I survived again." And when he faced the Empire's forces, it seemed like he was waging a personal war not for money, but out of deep-seated hatred. One of them was puzzled by the idea of a mercenary who didn't even want money or to stay alive, remarking how strange that was, then wondered again who this man could be, recalling a rumor that he had once been a prince from a fallen kingdom. In another scene, on a snow-covered land, that mercenary appeared, being watched by a soldier. The rumors said this mercenary was actually looking for his death in every battle. The soldier removed his helmet and murmured the mercenary's name, Yuri Briol, the third prince of the kingdom of Briol. "You don't deserve the peace of death, you who destroyed your own kingdom with your own hands." In a flashback to 10 years ago, inside a loud casino, Yuri was an 8-year-old, laughing and playing like he owned the world. He looked pleased with himself, announcing that luck was on his side that night. Next to him sat Hernando, the royal magician, who commented in surprise on Yuri's repeated wins, wondering what his secret was. Yuri replied it was just luck, insisting he didn't have any secrets or special skills. He then suggested to Hernando that they play another round, but this time double the stakes. Though Hernando reminded him it was time to leave because they had an important appointment on their schedule. Before they could go, a group of angry men blocked their path, accusing Yuri of cheating at the game. Yuri flared up and asked what they thought they were doing and who they thought he was. They shot back with sarcasm, saying that even being a noble wouldn't stop them from killing him. They didn't stop there. They insulted him and his family with degrading words, saying the children of kings think the whole world belongs to them. At that moment, Yuri lost his cool, flipped the table hard to everyone's shock, and stepped forward over the shattered glass on the floor. He looked at them with contempt and coldly announced his name, Yuri Briol, third prince of the kingdom of Briol. He stepped closer and added, "Today, I'll grant you a new birth with my own hands." As a smile spread across his face, the men began to back away in fear, and one of them screamed in terror. Later, we see Yuri talking to a girl as if he were trying to justify his actions. She was Princess Katerina Granzane. Yuri told her he was late for an emergency meeting his father had summoned him to, and he gave her an explanation that didn't convince her, since she had also taken a risk to be there while avoiding everyone's eyes. Yuri asked her to let the incident slide just this once, explaining he was going through a rough time, that it hadn't been easy for him, and he hoped she could understand where he was coming from for now. Since his father was away at the moment, he said he had to be careful with everything he did. He told Katerina he shouldn't even be saying this to her. She responded with a sarcastic tone and asked if she had become a stranger to him. Yuri tried to explain himself, but hesitated, and Katerina cut him off angrily, saying, "If you don't trust me, then why did you give me this necklace?" She then threw the blue necklace on the ground and turned to leave, telling him not to speak to her again unless she started the conversation. Yuri called out, asking her to wait a moment, but she kept walking without replying. He stood there holding the necklace, unable to decide what to do, while someone unknown watched him from afar with a sly smile. The next day, that spy made a move, leading relations between the Kingdom of Briol and the Empire to the brink of collapse. What started as simple provocations from the Empire turned into a conflict, then into full-scale war. When news of the invasion arrived, Yuri was stunned. The Empire's forces swept through the kingdom, fires broke out everywhere, and in the end the war erupted and went on for years, with rising casualties and no end in sight. In one battle, a soldier named Joshua was seriously wounded. The soldiers tried to pull Yuri away from the battlefield, but he kept asking about the reinforcements led by Fiore Briol, only to be told Fiore hadn't come. The absence of Fiore, the strongest man on the continent, tipped the scales of the battle in the Empire's favor. Yuri refused at first to believe what was happening, but as the defeats piled up, doubt crept in. Over time, as the losses mounted, Yuri began to connect the dots. His father's absence, the surprise attack, and Katerina's disappearance. He started to feel that Katerina had betrayed him. He sent her a final message via a carrier pigeon and got a reply later. When he opened the letter, he found just one line, "I'm sorry." His emotions sank deeper into the abyss of despair. The war went on, and he fought for his life, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. Exhausted and cornered, Imperial knights surrounded him from all sides. Yuri had already accepted his end and braced for it, but before he could be killed, a brave knight threw his body in front of a sword to shield him. It was Roland, who gave his final service to grant the prince a chance to escape. Though Yuri wanted to save him, he had to swallow his feelings, listen to the soldiers, and flee for the future of his kingdom. A few days passed, and the Empire was still hunting him. Yuri found a place to hide, but he knew he couldn't hold out for long. By then, he was completely consumed by despair, fully accepting that his father must have gone too. At that moment, an imperial knight found him, and instead of finishing off the last of the royal bloodline, Yuri begged the man to spare him for his family's sake. But the knight, instead of killing him, said the empire would pay for what it had done, and told the prince to run because others were coming. Yuri ran again, betting his life on the chance that he might get revenge one day. But in the end, everyone died, and deep down, he knew nothing would change, and that one day someone would come to take his life too. And so we're back to his encounter with the soldier who asked him, "Have you been throwing yourself into dangerous battlefields just to find rest in the end? Is self-harm the best you've got?" It seemed he would stay selfish to the very end, and then the soldier told him he didn't deserve the peace of death in the first place. Yuri realized this was information only someone close to him would know, but everyone was dead. That's when he started blaming him for everyone's deaths. The knight revealed his face, showing a twisted, zombie-like look. It was Roland, the knight who had once protected him, now back to take his life. He said Yuri was the reason the honor of his family, who had served under the royal banner for years, had been stained, and the reason his dignity and faith were shattered in an instant. Roland rushed at Yuri with fierce anger, calling him the one who should have died. Yuri was shocked that Roland was still alive, but he had returned as a vengeful wraith. He attacked viciously, and our protagonist realized he was paying for his unforgivable sins. In that moment, Yuri thought he might find peace in death, but guilt kept haunting him even in his final hour. In the depths of his sorrow and reflection, he remembered his father's words, "The Betrayal bloodline never abandons its honor, even if it costs them their lives." Suddenly, Yuri woke from his nightmare in a panic because someone was shouting his name, Yuri Betrayal. The voice kept echoing in his head until he fully woke up. He opened his eyes with great difficulty and found a strong, noble-looking man standing before him, asking worriedly if he was okay, because he hadn't opened his eyes for a full 3 days. Yuri spoke aloud, asking if the man standing in front of him was really his father, whom he believed to be dead. Inside, Yuri trembled at the thought that this really was hell, and that his father had died too. But his father replied calmly, with a hint of sarcasm, asking if Yuri really thought he'd ended up in hell. Yuri gave a bitter smile and muttered that his father, who always talked about honor, seemed to have lived quite the eventful life. By the end of their exchange, his father got angry at the sarcastic remark and smacked him on the head, upset at his meaningless words. Yuri started scolding his father, asking why he hadn't given up his bad habits even in hell, and told him to hurry up and repent while he still had the chance. While they were talking, Yuri noticed a green leaf slipping in through the window. He felt something strange in this calm, even if he couldn't put it into words. From his room's window, he saw the maids moving through the palace courtyard, and everything seemed normal, making him wonder if he was overthinking it. Still, he noticed there were no sinners, no flames, and no demons to torment him. He asked himself nervously, "Where exactly am I?" Suddenly, a worried voice yanked him back to reality. "Are you awake?" His father was standing nearby, with 2 other people beside him, their faces showing deep concern. His vision began to fade again, and it was clear Yuri was about to lose consciousness once more, and he slipped into a coma or a deep sleep. After he processed what was happening, he first wondered if this was just a dream, or if his whole life was flashing before his eyes. He tried to wake up or even change the course of events, but he couldn't. The world hadn't ended like he thought. On the contrary, the memories he'd forgotten began to return to him, repeating exactly as they had before, making him realize there was no escaping this truth. In that moment, Yuri accepted the idea that he had actually gone back to the past, to the spring of his 13th year. Fate had given him a second chance. The next morning, the servants opened the curtains, calling on Yuri to wake up, pointing out that it was time for sword training. Yuri jumped out of bed, full of energy, asking for his clothes right away, before remembering he needed to wash his face first. The maid gently calmed him and asked him to slow down a little, then promised she'd help him wash his face. She asked him to sit down, and in that instant a very painful memory swept over Yuri. He had seen this maid die before under tragic circumstances. He felt deep sadness and intense regret. Yuri fell silent for a moment, then called out to her. "Aina," she answered. "Yes, your highness." Suddenly, he asked her to slap him in the face 3 times. Hard. Aina was confused by the strange request and asked nervously, "Are you asking me to commit treason?" He replied confidently, joking, "It's not treason if it's a direct order from the prince." Then he assured her he was completely serious about his request, adding confidently, "I always keep my promises." The day started completely normal. The air was nice and still, and the weather outside the room was bright and calm. Later in the training yard, Yuri felt a sharp pain from the 3 slaps Aina had given him. He was surprised at how strong she was, stronger than he remembered. As he silently watched a group of people pass by, he felt disappointed that none of them offered to put something on the bruise on his face, and not a single person even asked him what had happened. When the training session with his instructor Bernard began, Yuri noticed that even Bernard didn't show any concern for his obvious injury, as if it didn't matter to him at all. During the sparring session, Yuri's frustration grew. Bernard ignored correcting his stances or giving any guidance, and just kept sparring in total silence. As they traded blows, Yuri wondered when Bernard had stopped teaching in his old way and settled for silent sparring. He remembered when Bernard once said to his father, in a sad tone, "Yuri has great natural talent in the sword arts, and it's a shame he doesn't make good use of it. If he were more diligent, he would be a great blessing to the entire kingdom of Betrayal." Those words were the spark that set off his rebellion. From then on, he became lazy and defiant, which pushed Bernard to stop teaching him seriously, limiting himself to sparring after realizing Yuri had become hard to deal with. Yuri felt deeply frustrated as he recalled his teacher's words, realizing they hadn't motivated him as intended. They'd only made him more careless and lazy. In the middle of the session, Yuri suddenly called Bernard by name. Having decided it was time to change things, he said firmly, "From now on, I want to learn properly. I don't want any leniency or sugarcoating. As Yuri Betrayal, I'll be completely serious." Bernard was a little surprised by the sudden change, but he accepted it and said, "I don't know what changed in you, but if you're serious, training from now on will be serious." Immediately, Bernard got ready, gripped his wooden sword, and showed his resolve to start real, rigorous training. He told Yuri it was time to get serious. Bernard attacked hard, and Yuri desperately tried to ask him to slow down or go easy, but it was no use. Bernard was determined this time. He rushed at him with full force, and Yuri had to defend himself seriously. He steadied himself, trying to fix his stance and take a proper defensive posture against the relentless attacks. Bernard kept pressing with precision and power, showing off his high-level skills, which left Yuri stunned and amazed. He was shocked by how intense the training was, and realized this was Bernard's true level of instruction. By the end of the session, Yuri collapsed to the ground from exhaustion, but he felt satisfied because he had finally grasped the meaning of serious training under his instructor's supervision. He figured his skills would improve quickly from now on. He raised his hand to the sky, hoping for a fast improvement, believing his efforts wouldn't be in vain. At that moment, Bernard stood watching him in silence, surprise on his face, wondering to himself when the young prince had improved this much. Suddenly, Aina appeared in a hurry and shouted urgently to Yuri, asking him to come right away because the king was looking for him. Yuri was startled, wondering why the king was summoning him so quickly. Aina rushed to explain that Count Johannes and his son had arrived at the palace, which made Yuri freeze in place in shock. Yuri remembered that Count Johannes's son was Goth Var, the one who betrayed the kingdom in his previous life and caused its fall. He clearly remembered Goth the traitor's face, and a burning anger filled him. Yuri called out to Aina in a firm, commanding voice, and she answered anxiously, serious and angry at the same time. He pressed her to tell him where Goth was right now. Later, the royal family gathered with Count Johannes and his son at a formal banquet, where Yuri was seated opposite the guests. Those in attendance noticed a big change in Yuri and started wondering about the sudden shift, especially Count Johannes, who noticed the clear physical improvement in Yuri. The king laughed and said maybe Yuri had taken something special that made him improve like this, which led Count Johannes to jokingly ask for some of that special thing for his own son too. Then the king added playfully that the count's son was very smart. The count smiled and replied that he still had a lot to learn. Goth Var turned toward the second prince with a tone of obvious admiration, but suddenly he was met with a sharp glare from Yuri, and he froze in shock at the intensity of the third prince's look. The second prince leaned toward Yuri and whispered curiously, asking if something had happened between him and Goth. Yuri answered seriously, "Goth stabbed me in the back one day." The second prince was surprised by the blunt reply, and Yuri reaffirmed that he could never forgive a traitor. The second prince smirked and joked, "And are you just going to let it go?" But Yuri stayed silent, anger building inside as he watched Goth act arrogant. On the other side, annoyance started to show on Goth's face, even though he didn't understand why his expression seemed to ask about Yuri's motives and provocative behavior toward him. At that moment, Yuri decided to rein in his reckless behavior. He knew full well that in this new life he couldn't allow a repeat of what had happened before. Yuri wondered if Goth's betrayal in the past had begun with jealousy and resentment at this very early stage. Then outside, Yuri tossed a wooden sword to Goth and asked mockingly if he was really good with a sword like the rumors said. Goth hesitated and said he knew a little about swordsmanship, then asked what prompted the sudden question. Yuri replied that the kingdom didn't need knights who thought so narrowly. Goth answered nervously that he wasn't a knight yet, but Yuri firmly reminded him that he was supposed to become a knight who would serve the kingdom in the future. Goth said, Yes, that's true. Suddenly, without any warning, Yuri challenged him to a duel and rushed at him, shouting. Goth was startled and yelled in confusion, accusing Yuri of cowardice for attacking so suddenly, but Yuri kept up his merciless assault, showing skills Goth never expected, and landed a strong hit on him. Goth started shouting, asking Yuri to stop and begging him to respect the honor of knighthood, but Yuri ignored his words and deliberately dropped his sword, which threw Goth off. Without hesitation, Yuri charged at him and delivered a powerful kick that sent Goth flying before he crashed to the ground. Goth screamed in pain while Yuri stood over him with a stern look, remembering how Goth in his previous life had betrayed the kingdom and his father when he sold his father's reputation to the Empire in exchange for some information. Your father was a great lord and a respected knight. What was the reason he earned that standing? Goth looked confused by the question, while Yuri kept staring at him, waiting for a clear answer. Goth remained completely at a loss, so Yuri asked again, sarcastically, if the question was really that hard. Yuri thought to himself that maybe Goth didn't want to repeat his previous life, but this time he decided to force him to face the truth, and asked him again why his father had earned that position. Goth answered that he didn't fully understand what the question meant. Right then, Yuri decided he wouldn't allow any knight in the kingdom of Betrayal, including himself, to misunderstand the meaning of his position or responsibilities. Yuri's tone shifted slightly, and he told him seriously that he needed to see the truth clearly. Then he reached out his hand for a handshake and asked him to think carefully about his words. After that brief exchange, Goth left, while Yuri watched him walk away. The second prince approached Yuri and asked curiously, "Are you actually good at fighting?" Yuri replied with a question. "Did you think I was going to lose?" The second prince answered with blunt sarcasm, "Yeah, honestly, I did." Yuri was taken aback and asked in disbelief, "Is that really what you think of me?" The second prince laughed and said that Yuri had always been the kingdom's biggest troublemaker and gambler, so what did he expect? Yuri then declared that he wouldn't go back to how he used to be. He asked his older brother to stop causing trouble too. The second prince looked at him in disbelief, then glanced at Yuri, who was smiling calmly, wondering to himself, had Yuri completely lost his mind, or was he actually starting to change? That evening, after a long, grueling training session, Yuri collapsed to the ground, exhausted, and shouted loudly that training was finally over. Bernard stepped forward, praising the incredible effort he'd put in, then asked if he was ready to learn a mana style. This surprised Yuri, and he asked excitedly if Bernard would teach him his fighting style, but Bernard said no, explaining that his style wasn't strong enough for a prince like him. Bernard explained it would be better for Yuri to learn the Brilliant style, which is powerful and effective in dueling. Yuri then remembered that in his previous life, he had already mastered the Brilliant style and had reached an advanced level as a mercenary, but in this new life, he felt he needed something more. Yuri started thinking about other options available to him. Bernard noticed how deep in thought he was and asked curiously if he was considering a different style. Yuri asked Bernard to recommend one of the royal guards who had extraordinary natural talent and could teach him a new and different style. Bernard paused to think, then remembered the name of someone he felt was perfect for the job. Bernard said that if it was purely about natural talent, the best choice by far was a guard named Gerard, who had rare and exceptional talent. Yuri asked curiously about this boy Gerard, repeating the name under his breath as he tried to recall any past encounter with him. Suddenly, Yuri remembered he had met Gerard during the war in his previous life, but his skills back then were ordinary. Still, he was amazed that Gerard survived all those battles despite his limited abilities, and began to wonder about the real reason he managed to stay alive all that time. Yuri remembered that in his previous life, Gerard would kneel on the battlefield, scolding himself with deep regret for not investing his talent in training the way he should have, and that if he could go back in time, he would train himself to death. Yuri realized that back then, both of them had been helpless, with nothing but rusty skills that weren't enough to face the horrors of war. Yuri snapped out of those bitter memories and decided he wouldn't repeat those mistakes in this new life. He made a quick decision. He had to visit Gerard that night and pull him out of his laziness to put him back on the right track. The sky was clear at sunset, and the atmosphere inside the palace was calm as Yuri walked toward the training grounds. Russo turned toward the door in surprise when he sensed movement. Yuri entered with a smile and waved kindly at Russo, leaving the latter wondering why the prince would come at such an hour. Yuri replied calmly that he'd come to see how things were going in the training yard. Russo smiled and said they were doing their best, even if they weren't on the prince's level. Yuri watched the soldiers train with enthusiasm and admitted to himself that everyone seemed unusually fired up these days. Suddenly, he asked where Gerard was. Russo looked surprised, then pointed to the far side of the yard, where the new recruit was training. When Yuri saw Gerard training carelessly, it confirmed what Bernard had said about his laziness and indifferent attitude. Yuri understood the importance of real training. Training should always push a person beyond their limits, but Gerard was doing just enough to get by, as if he were just going through the motions without any clear ambition. Yuri felt disappointed and thought Gerard's skills had clearly rusted and deteriorated due to neglect. He then asked Mr. Russo to bring him a wooden sword he had decided to spar himself. Mr. Russo asked whom he intended to duel exactly. Yuri smirked and pointed at Gerard, announcing that he'd chosen to duel that slacker. The two stood face to face in the training yard, as everyone watched to see what would happen in this unexpected showdown. Some of the soldiers started cheering for the new recruit, Gerard, urging him to give it his all and stay sharp. Yuri stood confidently in front of him and said loudly that he'd heard Gerard was very talented and asked him to show whether he was truly a real knight. Gerard hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed to the prince's challenge, replying nervously that he would do it. Yuri dashed toward Gerard at incredible speed, attacking with full force and warning him not to disappoint him. Gerard was stunned by the power of Yuri's sudden assault. His expression alone showed his shock at the prince's strength. The two began exchanging powerful strikes with astonishing speed, each blow slamming into the other with force, sparks seeming to fly. The watching soldiers noticed that Gerard's movements were clean and precise, which made them cheer even louder for him. Gerard began to realize that Prince Yuri was fighting with high efficiency, but he also felt something strange and unsettling in this fight. They kept trading focused, powerful strikes, and Gerard started to notice an unnatural rhythm in Yuri's fighting style. He finally noticed that the intervals between Yuri's strikes were overly even, which made him uneasy. In that very moment, he realized that Yuri was controlling the entire pace of the fight. Yuri felt a calm satisfaction and confidence, because he had managed to impose the rhythm of the battle on Gerard and make him chase his steps. It started to feel less like a serious fight and more like a staged performance, so he decided to change the tempo. Gerard struggled to block Yuri's second strike and felt exhausted from the prince's sudden speed and strength. The two continued exchanging strong blows at a stunning pace. Gerard kept defending, fighting to parry the attacks, and began to feel that Prince Yuri had completely overtaken him. Gerard was filled with anger as he realized he'd intended to take the match lightly, but now he was being forced to exert serious effort. Gerard delivered a strong hit that struck Yuri, and Yuri realized then that this wouldn't be as smooth as he'd expected. He tried to withstand Gerard's successive blows, but he began to feel tired. Suddenly, Yuri remembered that in his previous life, he had been a professional and experienced knight. Yuri unleashed a final move that caught Gerard off guard, landing a strong, unexpected blow that hit Gerard and forced him to step back slightly. Yuri smiled and said, "At least I hit him once." Then he charged in, raised his sword high, and shouted with delight, "This is exactly what I was hoping for." The watching soldiers were stunned that the prince had managed to hit Gerard, and they began praising him in admiration. Yuri jokingly asked Gerard if he was going easy on him on purpose. Gerard, looking annoyed, insisted that he never holds back. Even so, he felt something strange and irritating despite being the one on the offensive. He now felt like he was the one being cornered. Yuri launched another strong attack, and his strike almost hit Gerard by a narrow margin. Yuri smiled after dodging the blow and said, "That last strike was really close." Gerard stood in the middle of the yard, and at that moment, the soldiers around him began shouting and protesting at his odd behavior, asking if he'd lost his mind. Suddenly, Gerard unleashed a mana blade and sent a strike at Yuri, but Yuri barely dodged it. Gerard froze in place, realizing what he'd just done, while strands of Yuri's hair fell to the ground. He had almost landed a lethal blow on the prince. Yuri stood there, stunned for a moment as he processed what happened. Gerard cried out in horror and regret, "Your Highness," as if he had just understood the gravity of what he'd done. Russo shouted angrily, calling Gerard insane, while the others rushed toward Yuri to check on him. Yuri moved his hand calmly, despite his injury, and said he was fine. The soldiers pointed out worriedly that the prince was hurt, but Yuri simply wrapped his head with a bandage and insisted that Gerard pick up his sword again to continue the duel, saying there was no reason to stop now, the fight was getting fun. Yuri then surged forward with tremendous force, and the two resumed their clash, their blows smashing into each other with great intensity. In that moment, Gerard clearly felt that the third prince was entirely different from him. Yuri was willing to push himself to the absolute limit and beyond. They stood face to face in the hush that fell over the training yard. Gerard felt his blood boiling, a feeling he'd never experienced before. Although he'd fought stronger opponents in the past, he had never felt this kind of thrill he felt now while facing Yuri. They traded decisive, powerful strikes, and Yuri's eyes burned with a determination Gerard had never seen before. Gerard wondered in astonishment, how can this young prince stir up all these feelings in me? How did he awaken something deep inside? Yuri pressed his attack and launched a strike that forced Gerard to retreat quickly. Gerard realized he could no longer afford to hold back. He gripped his sword tightly and unleashed a strike powered by mana. The blow was so fierce that it shattered the sword. Yuri's sword fell to the ground after breaking, but Yuri smiled calmly and with satisfaction, realizing he had finally achieved his goal, then said, "It's over." Gerard stood there, breathing hard, clearly in deep shock over what had just happened. Yuri reached out a hand to him and said quietly that he'd learned something new from him today. Gerard shook his hand, looking flustered, and admitted that Yuri had fought well. Inside, Gerard felt admiration for the fighting spirit and determination Yuri had shown during the duel. He wondered to himself, how can someone this young have such unshakable resolve and such a deep fighting spirit? Suddenly, Gerard realized he was still holding Yuri's hand. Yuri teased him, asking what he thought he was doing. Gerard was startled and quickly apologized, letting go at once, visibly embarrassed. Some of the soldiers started teasing him, saying he'd made the prince bleed, and asked if he planned to just stand there doing nothing. More flustered, Gerard apologized again and then hurried away. Yuri collapsed to the ground, panting heavily, and let out a long sigh. He opened his eyes in surprise as the soldiers cheered and praised him, impressed by the striking skill he'd shown during the duel. Suddenly, Russo pointed out that someone was standing beside him, turned curiously to see who it was, and it turned out to be the captain of the Royal Guard. Russo asked when he'd arrived, and he replied that he had just gotten there. Yuri was still sprawled on the ground, exhausted from the match, while Captain Sanad stood silently watching, seemingly deep in thought about something. A few days later, the atmosphere in the royal palace was calm and bright. Gerard appeared, walking quietly alone in the palace garden, as if lost in thought. Suddenly he heard someone ask him if he had finished his shift. It was the third prince, Yuri, leaning against a pillar while looking at him. Gerard called out to him in surprise. Yuri smiled faintly, like he had something in mind. He told him he needed him to come along, explaining there was a place they had to go that day. But Gerard hesitated a bit, saying he needed to train first. Yuri suddenly stood up, turned to him jokingly, and asked if he'd come to his senses after what happened in their duel, reminding him that it was thanks to him, so he owed him now. Gerard felt there was no way out, so he sighed softly and replied, "I understand." Yuri watched Gerard and noticed that his body had gotten a bit stronger. Although he knew it still wasn't enough, he found it acceptable for now. Gerard began following Yuri, asking with great curiosity where they were headed. Yuri answered quickly and cheerfully that he just needed to follow him quietly and stop asking questions. Yuri paused for a moment, then turned to Gerard, who looked worried, and told him calmly that they'd be taking a third person with them, so there was no need to worry. When Gerard asked who that person was, Yuri didn't answer, and instead started calling out loudly. The royal mage, Hernando, turned toward the voice and walked over to ask what the prince wanted. Yuri told him he needed his help to go somewhere. Hernando hesitated, saying he was busy with urgent matters, but Yuri offered to pay off his gambling debts, which made him reconsider. Hernando asked if he was serious. Yuri confirmed it, and added that he'd also settle everything he'd lost to him before. Then Yuri jokingly asked if he'd ever lied to him, and Hernando replied, "I haven't seen you lie outside the gambling hall." Yuri laughed and insisted he didn't lie, though he felt a bit embarrassed about what he'd been up to before. After confirming his commitment to pay off the debt, Yuri asked Hernando to join them. Hernando agreed and said he wanted a contract in that case, pulling one out of his jacket. Yuri looked at him silently and wondered if a prince's word was worth so little, then asked Gerard to be the guarantor. Gerard was surprised, but eventually agreed after Yuri told him he'd be his witness. Hernando agreed, and the three set off, ready to depart. Gerard asked where they were going. After a brief silence, Yuri replied that they were going to the Mountain of Swords. The name startled the two of them, and then Yuri announced that their goal was to enter the ancestor's dungeon. The three went down a secret passage under the palace. Gerard expressed his surprise that such a place existed, then asked where they were headed. Yuri told him that this path led to the Sword Mountain. Gerard asked if he meant the mountain tied to the legend of the family's first ancestor. Yuri confirmed it. According to his memories from his previous life, after the imperial invasion of the kingdom of Betrayal, the empire seized the ancient dungeon inside Sword Mountain, where there were relics belonging to the first ancestor of House Betrayal. It was said that the inheritance had been extracted from there, which caused a major stir at the time. Yuri remembered that this passage had only ever been used as a means of escape, which was why no one knew about it. But in this life, unlike the last one, where he did nothing but run, he decided to do everything he could to uncover the truth of the legacy left by the first ancestor. The three finally reached a secret exit that led into a dense forest. Yuri emerged first, followed by Gerard and Hernando, and the latter pointed out that this path would take them straight to Sword Mountain. Hernando then wondered how the prince had gotten the key to the secret door, especially since it was a rare artifact. Yuri remembered finding the key hidden in the corner of the reading room just like in his previous life. Back then, he hadn't known how to use it properly, and he paid a heavy price for his ignorance, but he told Hernando it wasn't his business. As they walked, Hernando was suddenly cut by sharp plant leaves. Yuri advised him to be more careful, explaining that the plants here had cutting leaves, and told him to stay close to avoid getting hurt again. Yuri kept moving forward cautiously while Hernando watched him silently from behind. Suddenly, Hernando turned to Gerard and called him, then quietly asked if the prince had eaten something strange recently, shocked by his recent behavior. At that moment, Yuri ordered them to hurry. Hernando smiled and said that the prince's temperament hadn't changed despite everything. Then Yuri suddenly stopped and ordered them to halt. In front of them stood a group of giant wolves. Yuri explained that wolves move in packs, and it was impossible to predict their exact number. Hernando was surprised that Yuri knew this and asked, "How did you know that?" Yuri replied, "I read it in a book." Hernando was stunned, but Yuri ignored his reaction and told them to move quietly and quickly since the wolves hadn't noticed them yet. Hernando started moving, but he stepped on a tree branch and snapped it by accident. He smiled awkwardly and said, "My bad." Suddenly, a huge wolf leaped at him from behind. Gerard shouted a warning, then moved quickly, using his sword to strike the wolf's neck hard, sending it crashing to the ground. In that moment, Yuri expressed his admiration for Gerard's quick reflexes and praised him for using mana, since the wolf's fur was tough. But he also warned him that the danger wasn't over yet, because he had just drawn the pack leader's attention. The massive wolf raised its head and let out a loud howl to summon the rest of the wolves, and soon the three found themselves surrounded by an angry pack. Gerard wrapped his sword in a blue aura and shouted for Yuri and Hernando to stay close so he could protect them. Two wolves suddenly jumped at Gerard, but he managed to block the attack. Hernando commented that his skill was fitting for a royal guard from the kingdom of Betrayal, and Yuri agreed that Gerard was skilled, but he also pointed out that Gerard's current abilities, impressive as they were, still weren't enough to take on all the wolves. Gerard was starting to tire. Yuri turned to Hernando and said that the king trusted him and his abilities, and that it was time to prove that trust was well placed. Hernando smiled, released his magical energy, and asked Yuri if he wanted him to show his full power in this fight. Gerard was surprised and asked what he meant by that strange comment. At that moment, Hernando launched a fireball toward the wolf, and at the same time Gerard's sword strike knocked it off course. The wolf took the hit, causing a violent explosion in the area. As the sun neared the horizon, the three finally reached their destination. Yuri said he hadn't expected to run into monsters other than wolves along the way. Gerard agreed, admitting the fights had delayed them a lot. The three stood at the summit of Sword Mountain, and Yuri declared that this was the peak they had been aiming for. But Gerard wondered if this was really the right place, since there were no obvious signs of ruins or anything of importance. Yuri insisted the location was correct, and began searching around anxiously, saying he was supposed to find something here. Moments later, he spotted a small object glinting between the rocks, and announced that he'd found what they were looking for. He hurried toward the shimmering object, and called out to Gerard to come help him pull it out. Gerard asked Hernando to help, but the latter hesitated, and said that an injury to the hand is an insult for a mage. Meanwhile, Yuri dug into the ground, bent down, and pulled out a strangely shaped sword that had been embedded in the soil, with a red gem in its center. He lifted the sword and examined it. Hernando commented that the magic felt brand new, as if it hadn't been buried for long. Yuri read a word engraved on the sword, "Comet," and that puzzled him. He wondered what it meant. Gerard came closer and asked if this sword was part of the founder's legacy. Yuri said he didn't know. Just then, the ground began to tremble beneath them, but Yuri calmly said he thought they would find out the truth very soon. The increasing tremors cracked the earth, and Yuri, Gerard, and Hernando fell into the abyss. Yuri woke up quickly and found himself on the ground on top of Gerard, surrounded by a faint mana aura, which made it clear that Gerard had used mana to protect his body during the fall. Yuri looked at him with admiration for his quick thinking. Hernando flew over to them using magic and marveled at how deep the place was. Yuri said, "So you chose to protect yourself instead of worrying about the prince's safety?" Hernando replied nervously that he hadn't had time to intervene. Then Hernando noticed something in the dark. His expression changed, and he shouted a warning to Yuri. At first, Yuri didn't take it seriously, and thought it was just an attempt to change the subject, but Hernando insisted he'd seen a ghost. Yuri looked back and saw a mysterious figure emerging from the shadows, clad in dark armor and surrounded by a heavy aura. He realized immediately that he was facing a death knight. Yuri rushed to wake Gerard and ordered him to get up right away, but Gerard responded lazily, so Yuri kicked him hard to wake him. Gerard jolted awake, asked where they were, then screamed in panic when he saw the Death Knight. He quickly drew his sword and told Yuri to step back because he'd handle the fight. The Death Knight suddenly stopped, but Yuri stayed calm and said that a Death Knight is born from death, and once someone becomes a Death Knight, they're stronger than they were in life. But he added that he didn't feel like this Death Knight was a threat and that he was probably just the dungeon's guardian. Gerard was puzzled by that assessment and asked why. Yuri answered that he trusted his gut and that the knight was guarding the ancestor's vault and wouldn't harm someone who carried the blood of his lineage. Yuri approached the knight and asked if that was true. The knight didn't respond, but before they could continue, he drew his sword, and both Hernando and Gerard shouted warnings to Yuri about the sudden danger. A massive sword slammed down in front of Yuri, cracking the ground. Hernando panicked, thinking Yuri's head had been split in two that fast, but Yuri was fine. He scolded him for his reaction, and Hernando immediately apologized, saying he meant the hair. The knight finally spoke and said that Yuri's arrogant attitude reminded him of someone. Yuri asked who, and he answered, Eric Briol. Gerard and Hernando were stunned by the name. Gerard explained that no one on the continent could forget Eric Briol's name. Hernando added that he was the swordsman who conquered the continent with a single sword, the kingdom's founder and its first king. Yuri took that in silently, then asked the knight if he had been the first to reach this place. He said yes, adding that only someone with Briol blood could pull the sword. Yuri understood then that this was the legendary sword used by Eric Briol, and the knight confirmed it, adding that he himself had wielded it. The knight asked, "Why are you looking at me like that?" Yuri replied, "Sorry, I feel like I've touched something that isn't mine." The knight's expression shifted, and he addressed Yuri formally as heir of Briol. Yuri tensed at that. The knight asked him to explain why he was here. Yuri stayed calm for a moment, then raised his hand and confidently declared that he was the third prince of Briol, the rightful heir of Eric Briol, and he requested to receive his legacy. The knight fell silent for a moment, looking at him, then turned and said that the time had come to fulfill the duty he had long awaited. He agreed to give him what he had come for. The knight moved deeper inside, and Yuri followed, while Gerard stayed behind, watching anxiously. Gerard was confused. He never imagined he'd find himself in the first ancestor's crypt talking to a dead knight. He wondered what was going on and felt this was very different from the royal guard life he'd pictured. Yuri suddenly called out to him and asked, "What are you doing back there?" Gerard snapped out of it and recalled a moment on the battlefield when Yuri had yelled at him to keep fighting. He took a deep breath, told himself he was seeing all sorts of weird things, and followed after Yuri. The three entered a wide chamber lit by massive blue crystals. The dead knight sat in the middle, waiting for them. They felt a strange energy surrounding the place and shielded their eyes from the bright light. The knight's words echoed in Yuri's mind, "I hope you're worthy." Suddenly, Yuri found himself in a completely different place. He looked around and said, "What is this place?" He saw someone in the distance and thought it was the founder, but the being that appeared wasn't human. It was a strange creature that attacked him quickly. Yuri engaged it and tried to block its strikes. During the fight, he noticed the creature using mana and said in surprise, "That's a mana blade." He watched how the creature gathered energy into its core, then channeled it from within its body into its sword, and realized it was showing him how to use mana. The creature told him to step forward. Yuri asked sarcastically, "You expect me to learn in the middle of a fight?" He laughed dryly, then thought about his grandfather choosing such a weird method to train someone who hadn't even mastered mana yet, and said this would only work for someone who'd lived a second life, and that someone was him. Even so, he started focusing on using the energy and placed his hand on the ground, trying to transfer it from the earth into his hand, and it worked. Then he shouted at the creature to keep its focus on him. Yuri said he didn't know the exact method, but he'd try. The creature smiled, and Yuri replied, "Let's just do it. There's an often ofters lot of brast." Yuri felt stronger and remembered that the Empire would reveal its ambitions and attack the kingdom of Briol again. He decided he wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past, and would do whatever it took to become stronger and crush their ambitions. He began focusing his energy into the sword and said, "So, this is Eric Briol's art." Then he rushed forward and launched an attack, shouting, "I'll absorb everything." In the next moment, the scene changed completely. Gerard woke up in confusion, wondering if what he was seeing was really a training ground. He touched his head and said, "This doesn't feel like a dream." Then he noticed someone else and shouted for him to show himself. The man appeared, and as he came closer, it turned out he was an exact copy of Gerard. Gerard asked if this was the Death Knight's trial, and cautiously asked, "What's your name? Are you also Gerard?" The man replied with a mocking smile, "Don't try to defy your fate." Gerard didn't understand a thing, and the double started mocking him, reminding him that he joined the royal guard in search of a comfortable life, and telling him to stay away from the third prince, saying that resisting fate only brings misery and suffering. Gerard sighed and thought that his past self might have given in to that talk, but he quickly remembered Yuri and heard his voice in his head saying, "Isn't this boring?" Then he said, "It's just an act." He regained his fire and told the double, "Looks like you don't understand anything. Maybe because you're just a fake copy." Then he added, "Once the sword is drawn, there's no turning back. Clinging to the past is useless." The double raised his sword and started the attack, unleashing fast, precise strikes, but Gerard blocked them. During the fight, he noticed his opponent relied only on defense without taking any offensive risks, exactly like he used to do before. He realized that style no longer suited him, so he struck with a powerful blow that forced the double to retreat. Suddenly, a black aura appeared around his opponent, and a massive dark entity emerged from his body. Gerard wondered if this was his true form, but despite the terror, he kept his cool and thought Yuri must be facing a similar battle right now. He gathered his focus and whispered, "I hope you get through this, Your Highness." Then he prepared for his next attack. Elsewhere, Yuri was sitting exhausted on the ground after taking a heavy hit. The strange creature approached, raising its sword to finish the attack, but at the last second, Yuri grabbed his sword despite his injury and struck back with a powerful blow that pushed his opponent away. Yuri stood, gasping, then asked, "How much time has passed?" He admitted the situation had been dangerous, but he survived thanks to his training. He also realized he was starting to understand how to use the mana style and how to swing the sword, and he regained his confidence. He then noticed his opponent starting to fade and said, "Why is it disappearing?" The creature waved to him in farewell, and he knew that meant the end of the trial. Before he returned, he thanked it with gratitude. Yuri came to and opened his eyes. He saw Gerard and Hernando beside him, looking worried, then heard the Death Knight's voice from behind, saying mockingly, "Looks like what happened was a nice dream." Yuri asked, "What just happened?" The knight answered, "This is a test designed by Eric, left for the heir of his blood who would come here in the future." Yuri remembered that the Mountain of Swords had been destroyed in his previous life by the Empire, and that's why no one from his family reached it. He asked, "Did the founder Eric use this mana style?" The knight replied, "No." The Death Knight added that this was Eric's final legacy, which he created by merging his own knowledge with what he obtained from the East in his later years, and confirmed that Yuri was the first to inherit this technique. Yuri asked, "Why didn't Eric pass it down to the family directly?" The Death Knight explained that this dungeon only opens when the time is right, and its opening would be a sign that the moment had come to use the power hidden within it. Yuri asked with interest, "And when is that time?" The knight answered calmly, "It's not my place to say. You have to figure that out yourself." After a moment of deep thought, Yuri asked, "What's the name of this mana style?" The Death Knight answered, "Eric called it Soul Cutter." After a brief silence, the knight asked Yuri to kneel on one knee, explaining that he would now pass on to him the will of his ancestors. Yuri knelt in silence and respect, ready to receive this great legacy. The Death Knight placed his hand on Yuri's head and spoke in a deep tone, saying, "Never fear your enemies." Yuri replied, "Yes." The knight added, "You must act according to what you believe in." Yuri answered, "Yes." Then he asked him to fulfill his duty as a member of the Betrayal family to the very end. Once again, Yuri replied, "Yes." Finally, the Death Knight, gripping Yuri's hair tightly, said, "Remember this well. The Betrayal family does not abandon its honor even if the price is death," declaring this to be the Betrayal oath. Then the Death Knight began to fade away. The next morning, the maid Ina woke Yuri by opening the curtains and telling him that morning had come. Yuri sighed tiredly as he remained lying in bed, feeling exhausted from the events of the previous night. Ina gently asked if he was tired because he stayed up late, and suggested he go back to sleep a bit if he wanted, but Yuri got up slowly and stretched, replying wearily, "I visited the royal palace archives last night. I was really busy." Ina asked in surprise, "Why did you go there all of a sudden?" He answered calmly, "I was looking for a particular record the night before." Yuri sat in the archive room reading with deep focus, and there he found an important piece of information in the historical records. The family's founder, Eric Betrayal, had a brother. This brother was a man who completely abandoned his honor and vanished from history without leaving even his name behind. Yuri concluded that this mysterious man was the Death Knight himself, and that he was likely the original owner of the sword he had received. Ina cut off his thoughts, urging him to hurry and change clothes because the king had summoned him urgently. Yuri asked in confusion why, but she said she didn't know, and that the king requested his presence immediately after meeting the mage Hernando. Yuri felt a mix of frustration and worry, realizing Hernando must have informed the king about what happened. Earlier, while Yuri was walking with Gerard, Hernando stopped and said he would report to the king about what happened today. Yuri turned to him and asked if that was really necessary, and he replied with a calm smile, "I think it is." Yuri recalled this with some disdain, saying to himself, so he told the king everything. Yuri stood before his father in the throne room and asked if he had summoned him. His father replied that Hernando had told him everything that happened, adding that Yuri had not only left the palace without permission, but also went to the founder's dungeon in the Mountain of the Sword. Yuri answered calmly that it wasn't planned and just happened suddenly. The king asked with interest if he had found the sword he was carrying now in the dungeon as well, and Yuri answered clearly, "Yes, I found it." The king approached Yuri and told him he'd heard from several people, from his personal maid to Bernard and Sanid, and now Hernando, that Yuri had changed a lot recently. Then he gently placed his hand on Yuri's head and asked, "What caused this change?" Yuri grew very tense and gripped his sword tightly without giving a direct answer, and his father didn't miss that. The king asked him, his eyes serious, "Won't you answer me?" Yuri took a step back and said it wasn't what it looked like, prompting the king to ask again why he had retreated in such a strange way. Yuri said, "Because," and clenched his fist. The king raised his hand and said, "I understand." Then he decided to ask him. Yuri told his father he had seen a strange dream. The king was surprised and asked for details. Yuri explained that in the dream he committed a great sin. The king asked seriously about the nature of that sin, and Yuri replied that it was his failure to protect the kingdom of Betrayal to the end. Yuri explained that the dream was about a great war that destroyed the kingdom and took countless lives. He tried to change the course of events but couldn't, and in the end, he had to run away and died in a humiliating way. He noted that the necklace his mother had given him disappeared when he woke up. He told his father he thought the dream was a warning from his mother. The king asked him about the cause of the kingdom's fall in the dream. Yuri hesitated a little, since it was too early to mention the empire now. Besides, at this point in time, there was still a good chance the Empire's invasion wouldn't happen because he had started to change past events. After these thoughts, he said he didn't know exactly, but he saw an unknown army attacking the kingdom. The king fell silent for a moment, then said he didn't know whether the dream was just a nightmare or a warning, but he expressed relief at seeing Yuri in a better state. Even so, Yuri wondered to himself if he really was, and he still felt the weight of memories and regret, assuring himself that he was desperately trying to correct his past mistakes. After that, the king told him they had something else to do, and asked him to bring his sword. They moved to the king's private training hall. King Fury Betrayal was a prodigy who held a sword since he could walk, and that's what earned him the title of the greatest warrior on the continent. His name was etched into history for his astonishing combat prowess. Yuri added that there was a title called the strongest 10 on the continent, and his father was closest to the top. In other words, he was considered the greatest swordsman of all time. Yuri said it was the first time he had entered his father's training hall. The king replied that he never thought any of his sons had real talent in swordsmanship. Yuri replied calmly, "Do you think I'm talented?" The king smirked and drew his sword, then asked, "What exactly is a swordsman's talent? Is it about strength, speed, reflexes, or wisdom?" Then he continued, "If someone has all those qualities, does that make him a great swordsman?" He answered himself, "No." Yuri was surprised by the answer. The king explained that there's something more important than skills, a power that drives a person to surpass his limits, and he added that this power goes beyond fear or a sense of duty. Suddenly, a terrifying energy began to pour out of the king, and Yuri was startled and noticed the energy had changed. Then the king added, "It might be hard to describe, but it's like an inner calling." Yuri was surprised and hesitantly asked his father if this calling was like fate. The king replied that it might be, or might not, leaving the answer open. Yuri stood silently, gripping his sword, wondering if his life this time had been written with a different ending, since in his past life he wasn't destined to walk the path of the sword. The king asked his son in a serious tone, "What do you believe in? Do you think you were born to carry a sword?" Then he continued, "Do you feel an inner calling that ties you to it? And when you face death one day, do you believe you'll still be holding your sword?" Yuri felt fear and tension, and answered in a trembling voice, "I don't feel," but he didn't finish. He looked confused and anxious, backing away as he said, "Father." In that moment, he saw red eyes staring at him from the darkness, heightening his sense of danger. He started backing up, breathing hard. He remembered a voice from his past saying, "Run, Your Highness." Painful memories came back. He saw scenes of destruction and people screaming for his help amid flames devouring the kingdom. Soldiers fell one after another and the fire kept growing. Suddenly Yuri shouted, "What's happening? Why is Betrayal burning?" He heard a voice say, "It's the third prince. He's still alive. The last of the Betrayal line is here." He saw Imperial soldiers closing in on him through the flames and said, "That's the Imperial army." He realized then that he had returned to the moment of Betrayal's fall. The scene before him was harsh, and he asked himself, "What's going on?" One of the Imperial soldiers yelled at him, "Die!" and attacked. a direct clash began between them. They exchanged blows until Yuri managed to wound the soldier and bring him down. Briol's soldiers shouted for the prince to run, insisting they would fight to give him a chance. In the back, the battle continued, and some soldiers were injured. Yuri felt lost, wondering if what he was seeing was a dream, and questioned the fate of the kingdom. Was Briol's fall destiny? Deep down, he realized he couldn't change anything and felt despair. He stood amid the destruction and began walking slowly, recalling a promise he had made to himself, saying, "I swore I would never fear my enemies." He remembered the words of the Death Knight, and then regained his resolve. He charged forward, his sword infused with mana. He attacked the soldiers, struck one of them directly, and kept fighting, knocking down opponents one after another. He took a hit to the face and stumbled back, but regained his balance and kept fighting. The battle exhausted him, but he managed to defeat his opponent. One of the enemy soldiers shouted that the prince was just a dead man and threatened him with death, demanding he surrender, since he clearly looked worn out. Despite his miserable state, Yuri stood and declared firmly that the House of Betrayal does not abandon its honor, even in the face of death. Then he rushed forward, shouting loudly while repeating to himself, "I must fulfill my duty to the end." Yuri came to and found himself in a different place, still muttering the same words he had been repeating earlier. He heard a calm voice asking if he could hear him, then felt a hand touch his shoulder. When the voice called his name loudly, he regained his senses and replied hesitantly, "Father." Then he turned and said, "Where is the Black Army?" His father tried to calm him and asked him not to worry, explaining that what he saw wasn't real, just an illusion. After he calmed down a bit, Yuri looked puzzled about what had happened. He held onto his sword and started wondering to himself about the reality of what he'd seen. His father stood in front of him for a moment without speaking, then said quietly that he might have been wrong. After that, he affirmed that he would stick to the path of the sword. Yuri was surprised, then smiled and said he had made up his mind too. He looked at his father in silence and noticed the change in his expression, wondering if he looked like a man facing death. Then he tried to break the tension with a smile and said, "Don't worry, I'm a genius anyway." His father gave a faint smile and raised his hand toward Yuri, who was startled by the gesture. "And you know the rest? Legends, our hero got his fair share of the king's special boogeyman smack." The next day, Bernard was standing near the training grounds. He heard footsteps approaching, turned around, and saw Yuri. As he came closer, Bernard noticed the red watermelon on our hero's head and jokingly asked who did it this time. Yuri answered that his father was the reason. Bernard commented that the king must have been strict, adding that it didn't mean he would go easy on him in today's training. Yuri sighed and said he knew that all too well. Then Yuri remembered that Bernard stayed in Betrayal because of his father, so he asked him straight up if his stay was conditional on a duel with the king. Bernard said yes. Yuri then asked if he would stay if he asked him not to duel the king. Bernard, looking a bit surprised, answered after a brief silence, "Definitely not." Yuri didn't comment that this man was heartless as usual, so Bernard said he felt like Yuri wanted him to stay, and added jokingly, "I might consider it if you offered me something convincing, like the first ancestor Eric Briol's personal dueling style." Yuri was surprised by the request and asked in shock if he was serious about wanting to learn the first ancestor's style. Bernard calmly answered that the idea really did interest him, but Yuri immediately apologized, explaining that he couldn't fulfill that request. He thought to himself that someone like Bernard, known as the Sword Demon, would naturally ask for something like that, but he simply couldn't comply. Bernard understood that Yuri hadn't fully mastered the style yet, and took that into account, but Yuri told him it wasn't about mastery. The style was closely tied to his own mana style, making it useless for anyone else. Bernard was taken aback. This was the first time he'd heard of mana being used like that, since it's usually only used to enhance sword techniques. Yuri replied that this was exactly why he couldn't teach him the style, because what Bernard would learn would be only half the technique without its most important part. Bernard paused to think, put his hand to his chin, then said after a brief silence that it was fine. Yuri, looking relieved, asked if he was really serious. Bernard confirmed that he would stay in Betrayal as long as Yuri was willing to teach him the style, even if it wasn't complete. He was confident he'd benefit from it anyway. Yuri noticed Bernard's high self-confidence and joked that he would have to stay in Betrayal as promised then. Bernard agreed with a smile. After that, Bernard asked Yuri to start and show him the style right away. The two stood facing each other in a dueling stance, and Yuri began to demonstrate the soul cutter style, blue mana surrounding his body. But Bernard suddenly interrupted, pointing out that he had left out something important. Yuri stopped and asked what he meant. Bernard explained that he had planned to stay in Betrayal from the start. He let out a light laugh and added that the king had asked him to stay for another 10 years. Yuri was annoyed by this silly trick, then asked him why he didn't say so from the beginning. Bernard said, "That doesn't matter now," and asked him to attack him while he stood there without moving. Bernard smiled and noted that he would start the attack first if Yuri didn't, then raised his sword, wrapped in mana, which made Yuri angry. He rushed to attack, demanding in frustration why he was telling him this truth now of all times. Later that day, Yuri was lying on his bed, lost in thought. He started to realize the future really was changing, and he remembered the terrifying image of Betrayal falling, but a feeling inside told him they were heading toward a different future this time. He realized that Bernard's decision to stay was a sign that the change had begun, even if he hadn't taken any action yet. Before, he felt the responsibility of changing the future was a heavy burden, but now he felt more confident that the change had already started. He finally decided to face the Empire no matter what it cost, whispering to himself with determination that it didn't matter what happened, and that this time he would crush the Empire and never fail. At that moment, the maid Ina entered the room and pleaded with him not to cause any trouble this time. Yuri sat up suddenly and asked why she said that. She answered that she was sure he knew why, but he didn't notice things because he got into trouble every day, to the point he didn't even know which incident she meant. She then told him he had an important meeting the next morning. Yuri responded awkwardly, asking what kind of meeting. She explained it was a Senate meeting and that the king had asked her to make sure he attended this time. He looked a bit annoyed, but she continued, explaining that the meeting would be held in the morning and that most of the council members would attend, noting that some of them were known for their harsh tempers and intimidating personalities. She sincerely asked him not to assault anyone during the discussion. Yuri chuckled softly and took her hands, reassuring her that he no longer acted that way. She asked nervously if he was sure, and he confirmed it. The next morning, the Senate gathered in a large hall filled with tension. Suddenly, one of the members shouted angrily and slammed the table, rejecting something. Yuri sat quietly, staring at the man, thinking Ina had been absolutely right to be worried about this meeting. The angry man was Duke Gerard, and he opened the meeting by publicly rejecting the Mano technique Prince Yuri was learning. He pointed out that it wasn't officially recognized and that it wasn't befitting of the royal family. Yuri looked at the other members, wondering what the motive behind this attack was, especially since the primary purpose of the meeting was to discuss matters of the kingdom, not criticize the king's choices. As the moments passed, he began to understand that this meeting was nothing more than a means to undermine his father's authority, which made him realize why the king avoided attending such gatherings. The Duke continued his objection, saying it would be better for the prince to learn the traditional sword style approved in the kingdom of Betrayal, instead of adopting a questionable technique. At this point, one of those present interrupted, pointing out that the technique the prince was training in was the legacy of the founding king himself, asking how it could be considered unrecognized. Gerard replied sarcastically, questioning the validity of that claim, and demanded proof that the technique really belonged to the founder. His comment upset some of those present, who asked if he was doubting the prince's word, but Gerard answered calmly, claiming he wasn't doubting anyone, that he only cared about the prince's safety and was looking for facts. Yuri then stepped in with a calm smile and remarked that he hadn't known Duke Gerard cared so much about his safety that he'd dedicate an entire council meeting to discussing the mana technique he was using. At that moment, Yuri remembered that in his past life, Gerard betrayed the kingdom after Betrayal fell and surrendered easily to the Empire. Anger took hold of him at the memory, but he hid his emotions. Gerard directed his question to the captain of the Royal Guard, Saland, asking his opinion of the technique. The captain hesitated a little, then replied that he couldn't deliver a final judgment at the moment, explaining that every mana style had its strengths and weaknesses, and its effectiveness varied depending on the user. Gerard seized on this statement and took it as proof of how dangerous the technique was, insisting it should be thrown out entirely. At that point, the man with green hair stepped in, explaining that the commander hadn't questioned the technique's safety, he'd only pointed out that its results vary from person to person, which is normal. But one of Gerard's supporters ignored him and doubled down on the Duke's position, again expressing concern for the prince's safety. Tension filled the meeting, and Yuri felt frustrated and angry, especially after noticing some attendees starting to lean toward the Duke's opinion. He realized things were looking bad, and thought to himself that if he were still at the beginning of his training in the soul cutter style, he might have been able to change it, but since it had become part of the core of his power due to the training he went through in the ancestor's illusion, that was no longer possible. He also knew he couldn't explain all that to the council. Suddenly, someone broke the silence, saying the prince's words were convincing. Everyone turned toward the voice as a man raised his hand calmly and asked permission to speak, then introduced himself as Calcio Iransha, and we learn he's a free baron. The man asked if anyone there had ever fought an orc before, but no one answered, and the room went quiet. Gerard shot him a sharp look and demanded to know his identity and official position. The man replied with a calm smile that, as he said, he was just a free baron. Gerard snapped and demanded to know what a free baron was doing in a Senate meeting, reminding everyone that this council was reserved for specific people only. Iransha replied simply that he hadn't wanted to attend either, but what could he do? He then explained that Count Sedor was the one who asked him to be there. Yuri was surprised Count Sedor was the border lord, a man who'd spent his life on the battlefield and wasn't known for attending political events or noble gatherings, which made his involvement in this meeting unexpected. One attendee began to openly wonder why the count had sent someone to represent him. Iransha answered that he wasn't obligated to explain, but after seeing how some high-ranking nobles were playing politics, he fully understood why the Lord had sent him to this meeting. He added that the type of Mana style doesn't matter on the battlefield, whether it's the Betrayal style or the Imperial Lion style. What matters in the end is the person using it. Then he turned to Prince Yuri and asked for his opinion. Yuri said he saw no reason why learning the technique left by his founding grandfather should be controversial, insisting he would learn it whether the council agreed or not. Iransha didn't hesitate to back him up, affirming that if he wanted to follow the founder's will, no one had the right to object. Then he looked around at the attendees and mocked them sharply, saying that people who talk like this probably have never carried a sword in their lives. Iransha's words enraged Lord Gerard, who called them insolent, but Iransha calmly apologized for his tone, explaining that those who fight orcs every day on the front lines inevitably talk that way. He then bluntly asked how many of them had actually fought orcs, before adding another question. Does anyone seriously think those beasts care what kind of mana is used against them? Even though the attendees couldn't refute his logic, one of them expressed reservations about the prince's age, saying he was still too young to be making decisions this big. Yuri stepped in with a serious tone and mocked their fear, asking if they were so terrified of the wrong decision, then why not scrap the mana system entirely and start over? He sharply asked if they realized how impossible that would be in practice. Iransha chimed in, saying it was obvious the prince was determined not to back down, and turned to the nobles to ask whether they planned to rip the mana core out of the prince by force. That fool loyal to Gerard denied any such intention, so Iransha smiled and asked what the point of all this fuss was. He then turned to Yuri and asked if he agreed, before criticizing the other nobles for putting undue pressure on the prince. He didn't miss the chance to mock the capital, which seemed to have plenty of time to waste on trivial matters. His comment angered Gerard, who said, "By your logic, the border front has been calm lately, despite the huge sums of money being poured into it." Iransha's expression changed, and he replied in a chilling tone that the front had never been calm, and that hundreds of soldiers die every day, pointing out that they apparently weren't reading the reports. He added that 4 men were killed the day he left the front, one of them a friend he'd had breakfast with that morning. He went on in a low voice to say that orcs don't understand the meaning of rest, because they live only for fighting and bloodshed. Iransha's words sent Yuri into deep thought about the orc situation, feeling that the threat might not be limited to Betrayal's borders. An old border dispute with the Duchy of Klein crossed his mind, and he remembered how the orcs attacked the lands between Betrayal and Klein, causing widespread destruction and heavy losses. Growing anxious, he asked whether the orcs' behavior had changed recently. Iransha confirmed they'd become more violent and savage. Yuri then asked again, this time about the Duchy of Klein's situation. The question seemed to surprise Iransha. Yuri told him the duchy had stationed forces there. What happened to them? After a brief hesitation, Iransha answered that Klein's army suddenly withdrew from the border without explanation, leaving the border towns completely ruined. He explained that the people in those areas were either killed or enslaved, describing the situation with one word: horrific. At this point, Yuri started to believe the timing of these events wasn't just a coincidence, and the possibility of internal conflict or even a broader conspiracy crept into his mind. But the meeting took another turn as someone pointed out that the Duke's third son must have caused a new problem. Yuri showed his annoyance and thought for a moment, while a heavy silence fell over the room. He then decided to end the meeting. When Lord Gerard tried to object, Yuri cut him off, explaining that there were more urgent matters than debating his little mana techniques, and stressing that the focus should be on the risk of war with the orcs and the Duchy of Klein, instead of stirring up drama about a teenage boy like him. Elsewhere, someone was secretly communicating through a magic crystal with an unknown figure. The person asked whether the third prince had really changed as rumored, and the man behind the crystal said, yes. The voice asked what Iransha thought of the prince. Iransha confirmed that Yuri's gaze was sharp and clear, showing awareness. The person then ordered him to keep watching, saying, it looks like the prince is worth paying attention to. When Iransha asked if he should dig deeper, the voice said to do so if necessary, then ended the conversation by saying he'd be in touch later, before the crystal's glow faded. Arantxa looked out the window with a long sigh, saying to himself that the place seemed quiet, but soldiers were still dying every day on the border. As he was taking in the scene outside, his eyes fell on someone who caught his attention. He stared again, and his eyes widened in shock when he realized the person was none other than Prince Yuri. Yuri was walking through one of the capital's streets at night, accompanied by someone else. The other person told him he'd carried out the plan as requested. They had successfully slipped out of the palace. Yuri didn't think there was anything to worry about. Hernando laughed, explaining that he was used to sneaking out, and sometimes did it 3 times a day when he was a rebellious teenager. Yuri pointed out that leaving the palace isn't a big deal, but Hernando said that going out alone is like taking a stroll. Going out with the prince turns it into a rebellion. Then he asked curiously if Yuri was planning to do something reckless. Yuri answered that he wasn't, and even if he were, he wouldn't do it in front of him. When Hernando asked where they were headed, Yuri replied with a faint smile that they were going to the biggest illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was stunned and asked, "Didn't you just say you weren't planning to do anything bad?" Yuri reassured him that he wouldn't, he just needed someone to get him there since Hernando knew the place well. And he added in a serious tone that everything he was doing right now was for the kingdom of Betrayal. When Yuri laid out his plan, Hernando looked shocked and wondered how much money he planned to take from them. He asked worriedly if he was really serious, but after a moment of hesitation, he smiled excitedly and said he was ready to turn that casino upside down. Yuri remembered from his previous life that the people of Betrayal had produced a few figures who caused major upheaval in the kingdom. The first was an influential moneylender who was the de facto leader of the criminal underworld. The second was a powerful woman who founded the largest trade guild on the continent. And the third was a legendary assassin who beheaded that underworld boss. In the previous life, the assassin replaced the moneylender and turned the streets into a land of terror, and the man she killed was named Goryo. Goryo welcomed Yuri and Hernando, saying their presence was an honor. Yuri asked if he already knew him, which surprised Hernando, but Goryo answered with a smile that he knew them both well, the royal mage and the third prince, and the least he could do was greet them personally. Yuri told him he'd made a smart move. He hadn't come to have fun or gamble. Goryo showed interest and invited them to sit and talk comfortably. They sat down, and Hernando, nervous, asked Yuri not to gamble, saying, "Didn't you say you wouldn't do anything bad?" Yuri told him to be quiet. Goryo was puzzled, saying he'd heard they hadn't come to gamble. Had they come to borrow money? Yuri replied without hesitation that he'd come to borrow money to invest in a venture. Goryo chuckled lightly and asked if he planned to set up a private fund, and that asking him for money instead of a bank meant he had big ambitions. But Yuri cut him off, saying, "That's enough," and insisting it wasn't his business to know the details. Goryo apologized and said he hadn't meant to pry, and Yuri clarified that it was fine, but he preferred to get straight to the point. Yuri explained his idea. He wanted to buy large quantities of a rare spice called mogranza from the Ekline Mountains, because he was sure demand would soon surge. He then asked how much money Goryo would give him. Hernando was shocked and asked what he meant by that, while Goryo showed some skepticism but noted that mogranza is used in luxury perfumes, questioning whether it was really worth the investment. Yuri reiterated that demand for mogranza would soon outstrip supply. Hernando started thinking through the reasons and remembered the recent unrest in the Duchy of Klein and the orc invasion, but he wasn't entirely sure. Still, when he saw the confidence on Yuri's face, he hesitated to object. Goryo said the third prince wasn't the fool the rumors made him out to be, and seemed to be hiding a lot. He finally agreed to the loan, and Yuri asked how much he could be given not as a prince, but as an investor. Moments later, Goryo asked him to sign the agreement, and Yuri signed it right away without any hesitation. After they left the casino, Yuri glanced at the contract while Hernando voiced his displeasure, insisting he hadn't expected Yuri to borrow money from Goryo without telling him first. Yuri replied that if he had told him the plan, the first thing Hernando would have done was report it to the king. Hernando asked if they were heading to the Merchant Guild now, and Yuri said he intended to file a request there. On the way, Yuri got lost in thought. Mogranza was basically a guaranteed profit because the only alchemist capable of processing it had been a close aide to Duke Ekline, and he was killed at the start of the Civil War. That meant the spice would remain without a substitute for a long time, which would let him sell it at whatever price he wanted. Yuri suddenly stopped in front of an abandoned building and, thinking aloud, said he couldn't entrust this task to just anyone. Then he suddenly shouted with delight, "It's here!" Hernando was startled and yelled, asking why he'd chosen such an old place. But Yuri ignored him, pounding on the door and calling out loudly for someone named Ellen Wood. Hernando tried to stop him, But suddenly the door opened and a woman appeared, asking who he was. She introduced herself. It was Ellen Wood. Yuri immediately introduced himself, saying he was the third prince, Yuri Betrayal, and that he'd come to offer her a job. She looked visibly surprised. In a moment of silence, Hernando shouted, asking if he'd lost his mind, but Yuri told him he'd started talking to him like he wasn't a prince anymore. Hernando's frustration showed as he pointed out that anyone in his place would say the same thing, baffled that Yuri would think of buying spices from a shop that was this bankrupt. Even so, Yuri was completely convinced that Ellen, who might seem like just a failed merchant going through a financial crisis right now, would later become something else entirely. In his previous life, Ellen had been the greatest merchant on the continent and the leader of the largest trade guild. No one was unfamiliar with her name. Her personality was totally different from Goryo's, the kind of man who wore fake smiles and hid his motives with shady tricks whenever he felt threatened. Ellen, on the other hand, took her commitments deadly seriously and never broke her promises with partners. Yuri smirked wickedly and said, in her past life she was a legend, but this time I'll make her a myth. Hernando, exhausted by the talk, asked if this was the end of his crazy plan, hoping it would be the last. But Yuri raised a finger and announced there was one more step left, which made Hernando scream like he'd seen a ghost. Yuri started moving, with Hernando following and nervously asking what he was planning now, but Yuri didn't answer, deep in thought. After borrowing from Goryo and making use of the legendary merchant, it was time to find the person who would be the key to completing his plan. The two walked through a poor neighborhood steeped in darkness and silence. They passed a young man sitting in a shadowy corner, then saw a group of men brawling in an alley. Even so, Yuri kept going, searching for the person he'd come for. Suddenly he stopped, looked around, and confirmed to himself that this was the place. He soon found the one he was looking for. He approached a group of youths, gathered around something, greeted them calmly, and introduced himself. I'm Yuri, the third prince of the kingdom of Betrayal. One of them stared in shock and asked if he was really a prince. Yuri confirmed it. At that moment, Yuri remembered that the skilled assassin who killed Goryo in his previous life was named Asana, one of the few survivors of the Crimson Moon cult. Asana approached him cautiously and asked again if he was really royalty, surprised to see him in a place like this. He reassured her, saying he hadn't come to hurt her, but to help her. She stayed silent. Yuri then turned to Hernando and asked him to hand over what he was carrying. Hernando, voice trembling, passed him a pouch. At that moment, Yuri noticed a small girl clinging to Asana's arm. He wondered if this child was the reason behind everything Asana had done, and remembered that in his previous life, she had borrowed a huge amount from Goryo to treat the girl, only to be crushed by the debt and turned into a master assassin. He decided he wouldn't let that happen again, and would change the starting point of that ill-fated relationship. He handed the pouch to Asana and told her to use Mano treatment at the temple. Asana asked what he wanted in return. He calmly answered that he only wanted one thing, for her to remember his name. Then he left. As they were leaving, Hernando asked why he'd given all that money to a beggar girl. Yuri replied that he considered it an investment in the future. Yuri kept walking, thinking that he'd already started building relationships with people who would play critical roles in his future: Goryo, Ellen, and Asana. But there was one person left. He turned to Hernando and asked whom he'd seen at the first ancestor's shrine. Hernando smirked and said he saw himself as a gambler. Yuri was surprised by the answer and asked what he meant. Hernando explained that he saw himself betting his life inside the Parsegas casino at the heart of the empire, and that it suited him just fine. Yuri looked at him, puzzled, while Hernando kept talking with a mocking smile. Yuri turned away and said coldly, "Today you'd better be careful how you act." The next morning, Hernando stood before the king. The king asked if he'd gone out with Prince Yuri the previous night, and Hernando said yes. The king didn't drag it out and asked directly what really happened. Hernando calmly explained how the prince convinced him to leave the palace and took him to the biggest casino in the capital. The king was surprised and asked if the prince had actually gambled. Hernando confirmed that's exactly what happened. He added that he thought Yuri wasn't good at card games and lost all the money he'd borrowed from him. Then the king wanted to know what happened after that. Hernando said the prince went to Goryo to borrow some money, then went to a bankrupt merchant and handed it over. After that, he gave a large sum to an orphaned child. But Hernando didn't say everything. He just said they wandered around the city streets a bit, because the prince wanted to see how ordinary people lived. The king asked if Yuri had returned to the palace right after that. Hernando said he had, and added that that was all that happened. The king replied with just one word: "Understood." A short silence followed. After a moment, the king asked Hernando if he would attend the party. Hernando said he would. The king looked surprised because Hernando didn't like parties, but the mage replied that people can change their minds, and he hadn't joined a dance in a long time. In the training yard, Yuri was training hard with Bernard. During practice, he suddenly stopped and joked that Bernard seemed popular. He'd noticed some maids watching. Bernard didn't get what he meant at first, first, but Yuri advised him to attend the party, saying there was someone waiting for him. Bernard answered seriously that the party didn't matter to him at all. The conversation quickly shifted to sword techniques. Bernard admitted Yuri had been right. The technique didn't rely on a fixed stance but adapted to the situation. Yuri pointed out that it flowed naturally. Bernard said he really couldn't learn it, but he'd keep watching and studying him. At the same time, he praised Yuri's progress, especially his use of mana, admitting he was surprised by how fast he was improving. Even so, Yuri felt guilty, as he was trying to completely forget his old style, but it seemed things were going better than he expected. Bernard advised him not to push himself too hard and to train at an easy pace. Then Bernard said he was worried about him. Yuri was surprised and asked why. Bernard replied frankly that his improvement was too fast and his achievements were huge for his age, but his body hadn't fully matured yet, so he needed to be careful. Yuri reassured him he'd be fine and asked to continue training. Bernard was surprised when Yuri asked to use real swords instead of wooden ones. Bernard agreed and drew his sword. Yuri proposed a strange bet. If he managed to land a hit on Bernard would have to attend the party. Bernard refused immediately. Yuri was confused and asked why. Bernard answered that he would win, and Yuri never kept his promises anyway. He was someone without credibility. That made Yuri angry. "We'll see about that," he said, then started channeling mana into his sword and charged hard, shouting, "I'll get you this time." Even so, he couldn't land a hit on Bernard. Days passed, and the day of the royal party arrived. Carriages were moving toward the ballroom. In one of them sat the Empire's second prince, Georg Ivana Granzane, with Katrina at his side. He noticed the princess hadn't taken her eyes off the window for a while. She gazed out excitedly, delight clear on her face, and said she'd missed this kind of event. It had been a long time since she'd attended one like it. She added she was looking forward to meeting a certain someone that night. Inside the palace hosting the party, Ina asked Yuri what he thought of the outfit. He hesitated, then said he felt the decorations were overdone and too luxurious, but Ina told him she thought it was great, reminding him he used to like that kind of thing in the past. Then she told him she was finished. Yuri kept looking at her in silence, and suddenly called out to her and asked her to dance with him, which flustered her. He tried to explain that he wanted to practice dancing but didn't have anyone else to practice with. That only made her more hesitant. She asked nervously if it was necessary. He asked why she seemed surprised. She wondered if he intended to step on her foot and drop her on purpose. He denied it completely. Then she said calmly that she just needed to follow him with slow steps. Despite her nerves, Ina nodded in agreement. While they were dancing, she teased him, saying his movements made it seem like he was making fun of her. She was a skilled dancer. Yuri asked how many times she'd danced and with whom. She joked that she was very popular, but she'd never danced with someone as short as him. He said the height difference wouldn't be a problem for long. Moments later, he told her she'd stepped on his foot. She laughed and apologized, admitting she'd made a mistake, but then it happened again. The royal party grew livelier. The hall was packed with nobles dancing to the music, while the king sat on his throne, sipping his drink and watching. Yuri stood with his brothers, observing carefully, and noticed Count Sedor had shown up himself, which was rare. Last time he'd sent Baron Iransha in his place. Suddenly, he spotted his older brother without his glasses and walked over to ask if his eyesight had gotten worse, noting that he'd been wearing them a lot lately. His brother reassured him there was nothing to worry about. The royal trumpets blared, announcing the arrival of an important guest. The Empire's second prince, Georg Ivana Granzane, entered and headed toward the king. After exchanging greetings, the prince announced he had come with his younger sister. Moments later, Princess Katerina appeared. Yuri froze in shock. He never expected to see her while she bowed to the king and gave a formal greeting. In that instant, Yuri remembered his past and their previous relationship, but he quickly composed himself, deciding he wouldn't make the same mistake again and that he wouldn't approach her anymore. Even so, his two brothers stepped forward to greet her. She looked at them and smiled, while Yuri stood in the middle of the hall watching everyone. Cedric was dancing with one of the guests politely and respectfully, just as he always did. Yuri overheard someone comment that this was exactly what you'd expect from a noble like him, which made Yuri feel a bit inferior compared to Cedric. Later, Katerina drew near, but suddenly a young man approached and greeted her, asking for a dance. Yuri watched from afar, burning inside. He'd promised himself he'd stay away from her, but he couldn't suppress his feelings. Ina came over to him with a smile and asked if he wanted some cake. He thanked her calmly and told her he was fine, then asked if she was tired. She answered with a bright smile that it was nothing compared to looking after someone she knew well, making him realize she was talking about him. So he teased her, saying, "Enough chit-chat, bring me lots of cake." Before leaving, She told him she'd be around if he needed anything and asked him to take good care of himself. Yuri stayed where he was, trying to clear his head amid everything going on, when he noticed someone approaching. He looked up to see who it was. It was the second prince, Georg. Yuri recognized that face immediately from his previous life, when Georg had led the imperial army on behalf of the emperor to invade the kingdom of Betrayal. Although he tried to stay calm, he kept reminding himself not to show any hostility or tension in such a sensitive moment. Georg said, "So this is the famous third prince." Then he smiled slightly, and a frightening aura filled the space. Even though Yuri felt tense, he didn't show anything on his face. Georg asked his age, noting that he himself had turned 13 this year. He then stepped back with a cryptic smile, commenting that Yuri had some talent, as you'd expect from Fiore's son. That little hint was dangerous and made Yuri angry, but he made sure to hide it. He knew that despite his young age, Georg was a strong and intimidating person. He clenched his fist silently, with one thought echoing in his mind. This prince is a disgusting bastard. Both brother and sister are cut from the same cloth. In an unexpected moment, Ina accidentally bumped into Prince Georg, spilling red wine on his formal attire, which bore the imperial crest. Ina screamed in panic and started apologizing while trembling, her voice faltering from fear. What had happened was a major insult to the empire. Georg looked at her with a cold smile and said this was a problem. He drew his sword and declared that the girl had committed a serious offense. Standing before her, he coolly announced that the appropriate punishment for what she did, according to imperial law, was execution. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Yuri realized that Georg was deliberately humiliating and provoking the kingdom, and his anger began to build. Georg went on, explaining that beheading would be sufficient to carry out the sentence, then smiled coldly again. But the king cut him off, stating that this banquet was being held in his honor, and if the prince wanted to see blood, he should do it in his own country, not in his kingdom. Georg apologized to King Fiore, then started hinting that the relationship between the empire and the kingdom of Betrayal had always been based on mutual respect, but Fiore pointed out that Georg wasn't showing any respect for that relationship. The prince then reminded him of the Gatinsha incident, when the king himself executed an imperial knight, and how the emperor didn't take any retaliatory action out of respect for him, adding that the current situation was similar. What they intended to do, he said, was to protect the dignity of both countries, not to spark conflict. At that moment, Yuri remembered that his father really had killed that knight. The king put a hand to his head, realizing the kingdom's honor was at stake. While Georg claimed he didn't want much bloodshed and only wanted to settle the matter quickly, Yuri could clearly sense the great danger looming over the kingdom. Georg began to move for real, drawing his sword and preparing to kill. In that moment, Yuri felt that intervening now would be a direct challenge to the empire, but he didn't hesitate. Inside, he remembered the family vow that the kingdom of Betrayal never abandons its honor, and that he had to defend its dignity no matter what it cost. He shouted out to the prince, declaring that Ina was his personal maid and that the responsibility for her mistakes fell on him alone. The king suddenly remembered this fact. Yuri continued, insisting that he was a prince too and that this should be taken into account. Inside, he was saying that in his previous life, he'd been a criminal, and that this second life was a chance to atone. He then suggested replacing the death penalty with a trial by combat. Georg chuckled a little and asked if his name was Yuri. Yuri answered, yes. Georg then asked if he could address him by name without titles, and Yuri agreed. Georg then turned to the king and said the third prince's proposal was reasonable, asking if he agreed. After a brief pause, the king answered, yes, with a faint sigh escaping him. Georg announced that he wouldn't personally take part in the fight out of respect for his status, and would choose the youngest knight from the Imperial Guard to fight Yuri, since Yuri was young too. Yuri thanked him for that, and Georg replied that he'd see him later, then left the hall. Yuri approached Ina, who was still kneeling on the ground, flustered and anxious. He reached out his hand and asked her to stand. She was surprised by his gesture and tried to speak through a trembling voice, but he calmly reassured her, placed a hand on her back, and asked her to go rest. She said sadly that she couldn't rest while he was going through all this because of her, but he told her not to worry. After she left, Yuri started to walk out of the hall. As he walked, he came upon Princess Katerina sitting alone. He stopped for a moment and stared at her in silence, repeating her name in his head before pushing those thoughts away and moving on. In another corner of the hall, Hernando was quietly observing the party. Yuri, meanwhile, kept walking through one of the palace corridors, lost in thought, until his older brother Cedric suddenly appeared in front of him. Yuri hadn't noticed him, but Cedric asked what was on his mind. Yuri stopped, turned to him, and said he couldn't allow Georg to kill Ina. Cedric smiled, walked closer, and put a hand on his head, saying Yuri had a kind heart. A sense of relief crept into Yuri's chest, and a slight smile formed on his face as he said, "It's been a long time since I felt this way. When you want us tied," Cedric asked if he needed help, saying that a fight was no longer something they could avoid. He added that Georg might have said it to look good, but the reality was different if it were a duel with someone his age. Even if an accident happened during the bout, no one would be blamed. Yuri cut him off, saying he understood exactly what he was worried about and asked Cedric to let him handle it. But Yuri added there was no need for help, explaining that he had to finish what he started himself. Cedric just gave a calm smile and expressed his confidence in Yuri, then told him to go get some rest, assuring him he'd take care of the remaining banquet duties. Yuri thanked him, and Cedric left. Yuri thought, if the kingdom hadn't fallen in the past, Cedric would have become a truly great king. Right then, Yuri decided he'd do everything in his power to see what kind of kingdom Cedric would rule, and he swore he wouldn't back down no matter what challenges he faced, even if he had to kill anyone who stood in his way. The next morning, Yuri stood in the dueling grounds, ready to face the opponent Prince Georg had chosen for him. The audience watched in silence, eyes fixed on the arena. Hernando said in surprise that the prince would be fighting his first real duel, and asked Commander Sanad for his thoughts. In the arena, the Imperial Knight was preparing for battle. Sanad noticed that the mana around him was incredibly stable, and that he clearly had mastery of the sword, even though he hadn't yet earned an official knight title. Hernando commented that it was obvious the guy had exceptional talent. Sanad expressed concern for Yuri, but Hernando smiled with confidence. When Sanad asked why he was so confident, Hernando pointed toward the ring with his eyes. Yuri was standing there, stretching out of boredom, with no trace of tension or worry. Hernando said confidently that his appearance alone was enough to put them at ease. Here we learn about the rank of Archmage, one of the ranks granted by the Tower of Magic. It's a rank given only to those who've mastered Origin Magic. Among its rare branches is Fate Revelation Magic, which lets the user glimpse the future of the world. In this generation, Hernando is the only mage who has mastered this type of magic. In a flashback scene, he was sitting in a casino, stunned after losing a huge sum of money for the first time since gaining this ability. And to whom? Yes, folks, our protagonist Yuri. He wondered if that loss was just a coincidence, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He knew well that he could see other people's moves, but what really puzzled him was his inability to see anything about Prince Yuri. Everything he'd seen in his latest visions was blurry and frightening. A young man with black hair and black eyes, wearing the royal family's crest, with a cold, emotionless gaze. Without a doubt, it was the third prince. In that vision, Yuri was fighting bravely, his body covered in blood, before finally collapsing to the ground. Since then, Hernando realized the story he'd ignored revolved around one point: proper conduct. And as he kept watching Yuri's recent movements and behavior, he became convinced that Yuri wasn't under the spell of fate's revelation, and was truly someone without a destiny. In the dueling arena, Yuri called out to the Imperial Knight, asking if he was going to stop waving his sword in the air and actually start fighting. At that, Prince Georg asked Yuri if he needed more time to prepare, but Yuri replied that he was ready. The knight answered that he was also fully prepared. The king announced the start of the duel. The two opponents stood facing each other, each waiting for the right moment to land the first strike. Yuri launched his attack without hesitation. The knight was surprised by his speed but countered just as quickly. They traded powerful blows, sparks flying as their swords crashed. Yuri took a heavy strike that pushed him back a bit. The knight raised his sword high, ready to deliver another blow. At that moment, the king calmly called Hernando over, and he approached, waiting to hear what the king would say. The king asked what he thought the outcome of the duel would be. Hernando hesitated for a moment, then looked at the ring where the duel was fierce. With a slight smile, he answered that he didn't know just yet. The king reminded him that he had come to the kingdom of Betrayal, guided by signs from the heavens, or something like that. Hernando replied, yes. While the tension was written on the faces of the soldiers present, the king asked if it was time to leave, but Hernando said, no. Fiore said it was good to hear he wouldn't be leaving anytime soon, and Hernando replied that the king was granting him an honor he didn't think he deserved. He was just a lowly mage. But the king warned him not to overdo the humility, as it might bring bad luck, then asked if that meant he wasn't expecting anything dangerous to happen. Hernando didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked the king who he thought was stronger between the two. Meanwhile, the Imperial Knight had started a fierce offensive, pouring out massive mana, his eyes full of killing intent. The king calmly answered that Yuri's opponent was the stronger one. Hernando nodded, saying he agreed. He remembered the moment he arrived in Betrayal, when he felt the signs of the heavens had led him here. He thought the person capable of changing the fate of the world was here, but he hesitated at first, especially since the sword hadn't been drawn yet, so he figured there was no reason to stay. He explained to the king that he had thought his time in Betrayal was over. At that moment, the knight launched a powerful attack while Yuri stood firm. Hernando said he realized the time time hadn't come yet. Yuri opened his eyes, brimming with confidence, and began to activate his mana sword, declaring that the time for testing was over. Then he charged forward at incredible speed and said, "It's time to end this fight." The knight looked stunned by Yuri's sudden speed. Yuri tightened his grip on his sword and swung with all his strength. For the first time, the Imperial Knight felt a real sense of danger creep in, a feeling of fear. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "I'm going to die." In the stands, Prince Georg and Princess Katerina were shocked, while the king just watched in silence. Sanad was dumbfounded, and Hernando smiled as someone cried out in astonishment that they couldn't believe Yuri had activated the sword's power at such a critical moment. In the arena, the Imperial Knight froze in place from sheer shock, and his sword shattered under Yuri's finishing blow. Hernando then remembered why he had come to Betrayal, and realized inside that he'd been following the signs of the heavens, but had met someone who defied those signs. A smile appeared on Prince Georg's face. Hernando continued his reflections. Life has turned to death, and death to life, and the fate of the present changed the moment the third prince activated his sword. He saw that every step Yuri took was a challenge to the will of the heavens, and that he had surpassed the limits of the heavens. In the arena, Yuri was smiling, full of excitement as he listened to the crowd's cheers. Hernando carried on thinking, reaffirming to himself that Yuri Betrayal had truly transcended fate, and he exclaimed, "He's incredible." He said he couldn't contain his excitement anymore to see how far this young man would go. As for Yuri, he felt that this moment marked the true beginning of changing the fate of this world. 5 years later, the Betrayal Palace was quiet. In one of its corridors, a new maid was moving with nervous, hurried steps, absent-mindedly wondering how she got lost and afraid she'd get caught. Suddenly, a voice cut through her thoughts, calling out to her. She flinched and turned quickly to see a young man with black hair and a stern expression, who immediately asked if she was new to the palace. She couldn't miss that the color of his hair marked him as a member of the royal family. He asked sharply what she was doing there. She tried to answer, but her nerves got the better of her. She reminded herself of the advice from the older servants, but the words wouldn't come out easily. The young man repeated his question in an even stricter tone, and she got even more flustered. She started thinking that the king was known for being boring, and the crown prince for smiling a lot, but this young man wasn't like either of them. Her anxiety rose under his piercing gaze, and he asked in an annoyed voice if she was deliberately ignoring him. Only then did she become sure he was the third prince. She stammered as she tried to explain, claiming she'd been on her way somewhere specific, but the prince wasn't convinced, and asked if the servants had some kind of rule about not speaking to him, then said he'd teach everyone a lesson today. Suddenly, in the middle of that tense moment, a calm voice said, "Brother." The maid knew one of the royal family members who was known for his calm and confidence, so she had no trouble recognizing the person approaching with steady steps, carrying a sword, a dignified look in his eyes. The newcomer entered the hall and asked his brother in a sarcastic tone if he was bothering the maid again. It was the first prince, Cedric, who had gotten taller now. Later, we see Yuri walking through one of the palace corridors eating sweets. During his stroll, he ran into his brother and the maid, and it turned out the maid had given him the sweets he was eating as a small gift of thanks. Yuri thought the sweets she'd given him were actually delicious. As he was cleaning his hands, he said, "So-gyong of the Wounded Hand Kingdom." This person was using mana to reduce the strain on his hand while holding his sword, thanks to his growing control over mana. From this, Yuri knew he'd reached an advanced level. He recalled that 5 years had passed since he returned to the past, and the moment he woke up again after being killed by Laurand was still vivid in his memory. Standing in the garden, he realized that the peaceful days he'd been living lately were about to end. He looked at the palace and whispered to himself that everyone inside was talking about him now. Meanwhile, Yuri was knocking on the conference room door, listening to someone inside shouting angrily, repeating complaints about being ignored by the others present. One of the guards was standing next to him, apologetically saying the meeting was at its peak and maybe they should knock again. But Yuri started to feel really angry and slammed the door with his fist. Everyone was shocked. Yuri walked into the room with a smile and explained that his earlier knocking hadn't been heard, so he had to knock louder. He went up to his father and asked to join the meeting. The king waved his approval and asked everyone to continue their discussion. One noble started explaining the situation in his territory, saying they didn't have reserve forces to support the alliance. Another noble objected and asked if he planned to ignore the empire's request. The first replied that there were other regions that could fulfill that request, which only made his opponent angrier, and he started accusing him of being irresponsible. Yuri watched silently. He knew full well that everyone was calculating their own gains and losses, and that had caused problems at a time like this in his previous life too, when the Empire had requested military support for the Alliance army to face the orc attacks. He remembered how the Allied forces had failed back then, which put huge pressure on the borders of the participating nations from the orcs, except for the Empire, which wasn't affected at all. He'd understood then that it wasn't anything but a carefully orchestrated scheme. Because of those events, the kingdom lost a large number of its elite knights, including the brave knight Leon Flander. That's why Yuri decided this time he wouldn't let the tragedy repeat. As the debate heated up in the hall, one of the nobles reaffirmed that his territory wouldn't send troops, not even a single soldier. Before the argument could escalate further, Yuri stepped in and declared he would go himself, affirming his intent to join the allied forces, demanding that everyone prove their loyalty and devotion, adding that they had to act in a way befitting the kingdom of Betrayal and not bring shame to it. The king listened to his son's words and looked deep in thought, starting to understand his true motives. Later on, Yuri arrived for his training, and while he was practicing, he heard someone calling him from afar. He turned to see his brother Cedric running toward him, worry written all over his face. Cedric asked if he really intended to join the Alliance army, and Yuri answered that he was determined to. Cedric tried to dissuade him, saying there was nothing forcing him down this path. His status as a prince didn't require him to take on such tasks, but Yuri smiled and explained that what he was doing was the duty of the royal family. After a moment of hesitation, Cedric said he was starting to understand his brother's way of thinking and wished him safety, promising to protect the palace in his absence. Bernard was watching from a distance and was impressed by the strong bond between the brothers. Yuri joked with Bernard, asking if he was worried about him. Bernard replied that he wasn't too worried, because he knew Yuri wouldn't get hurt as long as he acted rationally. Yuri thanked him for his support, but Bernard pressed him to be more careful, explaining that dealing with orcs wouldn't be easy. They were both strong and cunning. He pointed out a special type of orc known as Bal orcs, who carried flags on their backs and were more ferocious than the rest. Bernard warned him to be extremely careful around them. Yuri reassured him that he had special means to handle it. Bernard asked if he had a plan, but before Yuri could answer, Ina entered the yard calling out, telling him a guest had come with something he'd requested. Yuri smiled and said he did indeed have a very special plan. In the guest room, Eileen's deputy guildmaster, Guillermo, was waiting for him. Yuri entered, and Eileen's deputy greeted him and asked where the lady was. He replied that she was still traveling and that he had come on her behalf. Guillermo explained that Eileen insists on going on her trips herself despite his constant advice that she take a break, but she always told him she was simply doing what she's good at. Yuri asked jokingly if that was the only reason he'd come, and Guillermo smiled and said he'd brought what Yuri had asked for a while ago. Yuri opened the box in front of him, a satisfied smile appearing on his face as he expressed admiration for the craftsmanship. He felt delighted. The box contained a set of unique daggers known as the Quadrablade. It's also .log. Guillermo eyed the daggers carefully and wondered whether they were actually valuable, as they seemed more decorative than practical weapons to him. But Yuri assured him they were extremely valuable, explaining that they were rare artifacts infused with ancient magic. Suddenly, one of the daggers moved on its own, and Guillermo panicked. Yuri calmly reassured him that he wouldn't die. Guillermo nervously asked if Yuri was controlling the dagger with mana, and added in surprise that he didn't know Yuri had that level of power. Yuri laughed and said he hadn't been wasting his time lately. Guillermo noticed a slight change in Yuri's expression and asked if something was on his mind, but Yuri said it was nothing important. He then asked him to send his regards to Eileen, and to send him a report later on the progress of opening the new guild branch in the Empire. Guillermo agreed, and then left. Yuri lay down on the couch, and after a moment of stillness he said, "You can come out now." Asana then slipped out from behind him quietly, like one of Seongjin's shadows. Yuri asked her what happened with Goryo. She told him she'd delivered the warning as he asked, and said she'd left a threatening note next to his head while he was sleeping. Yuri laughed and praised her, commenting that Goryo never stopped trying to steal Eileen's money. Asana then asked if he really intended to join the coalition forces, as she'd heard from the gossiping servants. He told her he did intend to. She asked him to be careful, and he smiled, saying she was talking like he was going alone. She looked surprised and asked what he meant. He told her she'd be going with him. She smiled, and Yuri asked if she really thought she could keep up with him. Asana left the room after that and said she'd rather go with him anywhere than return to where she'd been, and she promised she'd be in touch soon. A few days passed, and the time came for Yuri to depart for the battlefield. The kingdom's flags rose in the air, and Cedric called out to him, asking him to take care of himself. Yuri smiled and said he was invincible, and promised he'd raise the honor of the kingdom of Betrayal high. Cedric smiled in return, and Yuri teased him back, telling him not to overwork himself with studying and not to strain his eyes. Cedric laughed and said he would, then hugged him and said softly, "I'll see you soon." He told him he'd return safely later. During the departure ceremony, The king announced the start of the proceedings. Yuri stood ready to receive instructions. The king asked calmly if he was nervous, and Yuri replied he wasn't at all. Then the king asked him to look behind him. When he turned, his eyes fell on a large crowd of assembled soldiers. The king told him these were precious souls, and that he had to protect them. Yuri felt a sadness inside because he knew for sure that not all of them would return alive. Even so, he swore in his heart that he'd do everything he could so history wouldn't repeat itself. Then the king asked if he was confident he could shoulder this responsibility. Yuri replied that he could, but the king cut him off. In the next instant, Yuri suddenly felt a sharp killing intent aimed at him. He realized immediately that he couldn't move, and that his body no longer responded. He felt death closing in, and knew that any attempt to retreat would mean his end. He hesitated, wondering if he could face what was in front of him, but he quickly answered himself, "I can." In a flash, he burst forth with his magic power, and a bright blue aura flared around him. He unleashed a powerful strike, charged with that energy, clashing with his opponent's force and triggering a massive explosion and a violent shockwave. As the smoke cleared, he saw the king standing before him, smiling. Yuri was startled to see him. The king then said, "Don't stay away too long, come back alive." Yuri answered, "Yes, your majesty." After that, Yuri stood before the ranks of soldiers and shouted loudly, "I am the third prince of the kingdom of Betrayal, Yuri Betrayal. I invite everyone to place their trust in me." He raised his sword high and gave the order to move out, and the soldiers responded with a powerful shout, affirming their full support for him. Later, deep in a dark prison, creatures stood behind bars, staring with glowing red eyes. In the midst of that darkness, the old knight appeared and said, "It's been 5 years, and I will finally meet the third prince." Elsewhere, Yuri and his army were resting in one of the regions. During that time, Yuri asked the knight Raymond how long they'd traveled. Raymond answered that they were about to reach Sedor. Yuri said they needed to hurry towards Sedor in preparation for heading to Belshad afterward. As they were talking, someone arrived and called out to Yuri, making him turn to see a face he knew from his past life. It was Laurand, the one he had killed in that past life. But now, Laurand looked perfectly fine in the present. Thoughts swirled in Yuri's mind. According to the narrative, Laurand is the eldest son of Count Francis, and his full name is Laurand Flander. Laurand approached Yuri directly, kneeling on one knee and expressing how happy he was to meet him. Yuri was surprised and told him to stand, but Laurand insisted that there was something he had always wanted to tell him. When Yuri asked what it was, Laurand answered with shining eyes, confessing his admiration for him. Yuri was puzzled by this admiration, so Laurand continued, explaining that ever since his father told him about the incident that happened 5 years ago, Yuri had become his role model. He learned then that the prince risked his life to save his maid, raising his weapon and fighting everyone for her sake, which Laurand considered the true essence of knighthood. Yuri fell silent after hearing those words, then reached out to help him up, saying he was happy to meet him, especially after hearing about him from his father. Laurand, however, insisted that he was the one who felt honored to meet Yuri. As their conversation continued, Raymond approached Yuri to inform him that it was time to depart. Yuri agreed, but Raymond warned him that Count Sedor didn't have a good reputation, and advised him not to take it personally if he wasn't warmly welcomed. The scene then shifted to Count Sedor's castle, where a huge sign at the gate read, "Third Prince, we all welcome you." In more fact, upon arrival, Yuri expressed his amazement at the reception, and he was greeted by Count Sedor himself, who holds the title of Margrave of the Sedor region, named Haim Sedor. Yuri dismounted from his horse and thanked the Count for the warm welcome. The Count replied with admiration for the prince's courage, how despite his young age, he dared to head to the front lines, then asked whether he had ever fought orcs before. Yuri said no, explaining that he'd only read about them. Our clumsy hero nearly said yes. He added that most of his soldiers also lacked direct experience, so he thought it best to study them first. The Count praised his thinking and asked if he would accept a gift from him. As soon as he said that, one of the guards approached the gate and opened it. With Yuri and Count Sedor present, the Count motioned for the prince to proceed in that direction. Yuri entered with his soldiers, and the gate closed behind them, which made the soldiers tense and uneasy. Yuri looked at the Count, asking what this meant. The latter answered calmly, "There's no need to be afraid." In front of Yuri, a row of cells appeared. Yuri began inspecting the place until his eyes fell on the orc. Count Sedor then explained that they had managed to capture it after great effort, and had collected every detail possible from its small habits to its instincts. Yuri asked if this was the gift he meant. The Count confirmed it and asked, "Could there be a better gift than this?" Yuri smiled as he thanked Haim, then told himself excitedly that this exceeded his expectations, calling the idea of torturing the orc crazy. He turned his head back to where one of the soldiers stood and asked his name. The soldier replied that he was called Simon Fish, son of Baron Pulf. Yuri asked what was on his mind at that moment. Simon expressed his objection to what was happening, saying he believed what they were doing crossed a line, because locking up a creature like an orc in a cell and then attacking it wasn't acceptable. Yuri listened calmly, then commented that that was his point of view. He then turned to Count Sedor and asked him to open the cell gate. The Count agreed without hesitation. Yuri went back to Simon and confirmed his name again, then told him to get ready, announcing that a real fight was about to begin, and ordered him to face the orc himself. In the next scene, Simon stood directly facing the orc, watching it in silence. Suddenly, the orc started roaring with immense force. It began smashing its head against the ground over and over, until it felt like the earth itself was shaking from its violence. Panic seized Simon, and he shouted that it was impossible for him to fight this battle, saying he couldn't fight a helpless prisoner. While he was still protesting loudly, the orc's hand reached from behind and slammed a heavy blow into his head. The strike was so strong that his comrades cried out in shock, asking if he was okay. But the orc didn't stop there. It grabbed Simon in its arms with a crushing grip, prompting one of the soldiers to shout for everyone to get ready to fight. At that moment, Count Sedor entered calmly, asking them to settle down. He told them they had already cut off most of the orc's limbs, then turned to Prince Yuri and said, "This is the orc, Helbra Osnide." Simon was choking. The orc's massive hand clamped tightly around his neck. One of the soldiers shouted that they had to save him, but everyone relaxed when they learned the orc's tendons were almost all severed, so he wouldn't die. The orc growled like it was trying to speak, so Yuri asked Haim if the orc was trying to take Simon hostage. Haim said he'd call a translator, and a figure in a strange black cloak hurried forward. They slowly revealed their face and ordered the translation to begin. It was Corey. Yuri was surprised and murmured his name, and the other confirmed that it was indeed him. Corey raised his hand to his ear and started translating, saying the orc was threatening to crush every bone in the knight's body if the soldiers didn't drop their weapons immediately. The orc still had his hand on Simon's neck when Hernando stepped forward and began chanting. A stream of light burst from his hand, then he raised his palm toward the orc, forming a magical aura around him before giving the signal to move in. Yuri heard the order, took off at speed, and praised Hernando, then rushed the orc. He ran up, grabbed Simon, and wrenched him free from the orc's grip. With Simon saved, the orc exploded into a fit of rage. He stomped the ground, his eyes blazing red, and unleashed a thunderous roar. They watched his savage expression and felt that something was off. Yuri asked Haim if this was a normal orc. Haim said no, adding that despite its smaller size, its combat skills were exceptional. He explained that when they first captured it, it was devouring a knight all by itself, and that this orc had taken many lives. Hearing that, one of the soldiers shouted in anger that he didn't care if it was a prisoner, he wanted to kill it himself. But Yuri quickly calmed him down, telling him to keep it together. He said he wasn't stopping him out of pity, then told him to look behind the orc. He pointed out the red eyes lurking in the dark, and continued that they were all waiting for the right moment to strike. He added that the orc in front of them wasn't special, warning that the ones they'd face on the plains would be far more terrifying. Yuri patted the soldier on the shoulder, reminding him that this was just training a chance to learn how to kill orcs. The hulking orc was still standing there, ready to pounce. The knights raised their swords, infused with aura, preparing to fight. The orc charged in, swinging a flaming torch, but Hernando quickly raised a magic shield, forming a barrier that stopped the attack. The orc failed to reach Yuri and Haim, who kept watching. Then Raymond shot forward and finished it off with a single blow. On the other side, another orc was attacking Simon, but he managed to block it. Suddenly, the orc spat blood as Simon drove his sword into its body. Yuri clapped at that strike and praised him. Nice work. But the soldiers didn't just celebrate, their faces were weighed down by doubt. Yuri asked if they weren't happy, then looked at the orc's corpse on the ground and understood why. They'd passed a test against a foe that wasn't able to resist, which didn't line up with their principles. But he added that this experience would raise their chances of survival in real battles, and he ordered them to be grateful to Haim. Haim raised his hand and bowed slightly. "You may feel this goes against the principles of knighthood," he said, "but orcs don't deserve a knight's chivalry." Then he turned and walked on, telling them to follow. There was something else he wanted to show them. He explained that what they'd just faced was only a simulation, and that what happens inside orc camps is far worse. After a short distance, they stopped in front of another cellar. Haim turned to Yuri and said what they were about to see was the result of those atrocities. Yuri's expression grew serious, and he said he understood. Then one of the soldiers gasped in shock and asked, "What are we looking at?" They were half-orcs. Yuri furrowed his brow as he looked them over and said there were more than he expected. Haim confirmed it, explaining they weren't the type to show up easily. Simon stood there with disgust written all over his face at what he was seeing. Haim explained that orcs capture humans and treat them like playthings, and what they were seeing now was nothing but the product of that vile amusement. Yuri then asked Haim directly if he hated orcs. Haim's gaze hardened, and his voice turned cold and full of hatred. He said he hated them and would hate them until his last day. Yuri watched him in silence, touched his sword, and thought to himself that Haim seemed calm, like he'd gotten used to this kind of horror. He recalled, everyone has an enemy they can never forgive. For him, the enemy was the Empire. For Haim, it was clearly the orcs. Yuri had heard that Haim once found his son's body in an orc village, and that image must still haunt him, just like Yuri couldn't erase the image of his kingdom's destruction. Soon, morning broke and sunlight poured through the castle walls. Yuri stood contemplating the view when a report came in. Haim entered, with Corey at his side. Haim said Yuri should take Corey with him. Yuri recognized him and said Corey was the one he'd seen in the cellar yesterday. Haim confirmed it and introduced him by name. Yuri acknowledged that being able to speak the orc language was a valuable skill. Corey then stepped forward hesitantly and said he had something important to say. But Yuri raised a hand to stop him and said he already knew. Corey was flustered and confused by his words. Yuri handed Corey a glove and told him not to worry anymore, hoping he'd do his best from here on out. Corey held the item, puzzled, and started to comment on its value, but Yuri cut him off, calling for Sir Raymond and asking if the area ahead was the borderland. Raymond answered cautiously that it was, noting there were a lot of bandits, but he assured Yuri there was no fear of an ambush. Yuri smiled and shook his head, disagreeing, saying bandits were no less dangerous than orcs, and insisting they needed to be wiped out. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a group of people carrying supplies had stopped. Suddenly, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed. Something was coming. Men appeared on horseback with wicked grins on their faces. One of them, holding a blood-stained sword, stood before the people with a brutal, merciless look, then raised his blade and started slaughtering them savagely, blood spraying everywhere. Elsewhere, Yuri continued through the forest. He glanced back at Corey, thinking about the trouble it could cause if the soldiers discovered he was half-orc, but reassured himself that assigning Corey to Hernando had been the right call, confident Hernando could handle it. He remembered the confident look on Hernando's face, but admitted to himself that the situation was still worrying. Yuri pulled out a map and started studying it carefully, then waved his hand and called for Gerard. Gerard hurried over, and Yuri explained that reconnaissance from now on would be his responsibility, and that he needed to head to a specific location and check it out personally. Hearing that, worry showed on Gerard's face. He hesitantly pointed out that the area was full of bandits, and said their unit's mere presence would be enough to make them flee, then asked why Yuri planned to chase them all down. Yuri calmly replied that they had to hunt them anyway, adding that they were disrupting merchant activity near the border. Then, with a sly smile, he asked if Gerard lacked confidence in his abilities. Gerard stood there silently, weighed down by Yuri's words. Yuri went on to say he couldn't rely on the other soldiers because everyone was on edge, and that he himself was just a young prince without much experience. He admitted Gerard was a genius with the sword, but added, "If you can't even catch a bunch of thieves, then what are we supposed to do?" He hadn't even finished when Gerard leapt onto his horse, saying he'd be back soon. Yuri smiled with satisfaction, saying he knew Gerard could handle it and that it was good to see him fired up. Raymond came closer, commenting that Yuri was treating Gerard well. Yuri asked if it seemed that way, then said he simply enjoyed having Gerard around. After that, he turned to Raymond and asked if he could pose a simple, maybe boring question. Raymond said he could ask anything, so Yuri asked why he fights. Raymond froze for a moment. No one had asked him that in a long time. Finally, in a reserved voice, he said he fought for the safety of Betrayal. Yuri looked at him in silence, then smiled. "That's a good answer." With some enthusiasm, he ordered the others to keep moving, announcing that he'd go check on Gerard, and sped off. The scene shifted to a clearing in the forest, where scattered tents had been set up. A man was tied up and thrown on the ground, screaming at the top of his lungs. Another man approached and told him to be quiet. Just then, Yuri appeared, worry on his face, and grabbed a knife, warning the man not to do anything reckless if he valued his life. At that moment, Gerard was watching through a spyglass to report that they had found the bandits' hideout. Yuri praised him, saying he'd done a good job, then started interrogating the prisoner. "Do you patrol alone? Are there others nearby? And did the leader really send you out by yourself?" The man quickly waved, insisting it was true. Yuri watched him for a moment, then narrowed his eyes when he caught the glint of a pendant around the man's neck. He suddenly reached out and yanked it off, startling the man. Yuri held up the pendant and asked, "What's this? Is it yours?" The thief answered coolly that it wasn't his, explaining that the leader ordered him to wear it during patrols. Hearing that, Yuri got ready to draw his sword and asked if the pendant was some kind of magical tool, but the man, now terrified, insisted he didn't know anything. Yuri stood over him coldly. "If that's how it is, I don't have a choice." Then he turned his head and laughed. "I'll capture the leader and ask him directly." By then, night had begun to fall. While Yuri was quietly watching from behind a tree, Gerard called out to announce his arrival, then informed him that troops had been deployed along the thieves' escape routes, and scouts had been sent to gauge their strength. Yuri smiled in satisfaction and asked if the rest of the unit could handle things if he stirred up chaos. Gerard replied in surprise, asking what he meant. Without explaining, Yuri mounted his horse and signaled to move, saying, "If you're late, there won't be any enemies left for you to fight." Gerard stood there, stunned, unable to process what he'd just heard. Yuri dashed off, ordering an attack, while Gerard remained dumbfounded, calling for him to wait and warning him of the danger of going alone. But Yuri kept charging ahead enthusiastically, leading the attack, his voice ringing out alongside the horses' neighs as they headed toward the bandits' hideout. Inside, the bandits heard the commotion and exchanged confused looks, wondering what was happening. A man holding food looked worried, but moments later, Yuri burst in on horseback with his sword, violently breaking through the bandits' ranks. They froze in shock as they faced Yuri, who said with a sarcastic smile, "My bandit buddies, how are you doing?" It was dark by the time Gerard and the rest of the soldiers arrived, and they were stunned by the scene before them. Yuri was calmly sitting on top of a captured bandit, tending a fire, and he greeted them by saying they were late. Gerard rushed over in worry, begging him not to act on his own again, and pointing out how dangerous it was. Yuri responded coolly, "If you don't want me working alone, you'll have to keep up with my pace." Then he asked Raymond about the ones who ran. Raymond answered that they'd taken care of them without any losses. Yuri smiled happily as he grabbed a skewer of meat, suggesting they take the prisoners' meat and make dinner, announcing they'd be having grilled skewers outdoors tonight. Gerard eyed the meat suspiciously and said it was still a bit raw. Yuri shook his head with a smile, saying Gerard didn't know how to enjoy food and had a lot to learn, then announced they'd camp there for the night and resume their journey tomorrow. Meanwhile, the bandit leader woke up. Raymond stood and pointed out their next destination. Yuri said they would head to Jade before reaching the allied forces in Belshad, adding that it was possible they'd run into armies from other countries in Jade since they all used the same routes. Yuri quickly asked which country he meant as he struck a bandit, and Raymond replied that it was the Holy Kingdom. Yuri commented calmly that it was a nation known for holy magic. He added that if they got closer, they might help treat their soldiers later, but Raymond noted that goodwill wasn't guaranteed, then explained he'd heard the commander of the allied forces was a princess of the Holy Kingdom, yet there were rumors she was losing her struggle for the throne and was desperately seeking achievements to boost her claim. He added there was another rumor that she was willing to do anything with the coalition forces this time. Yuri sat thinking for a moment, trying to recall the princess from the Holy Kingdom. Since he felt concerned, Raymond suggested that he look more into her background if he wanted, but Yuri just smiled, downplaying it, and said he'd meet her face to face soon enough. The meeting point for the coalition forces, Belshad, required a stopover in Jade, an independent city tasked with supplying the army. Since it fell under a separate authority, Jade enforced strict neutrality. Yuri warned the soldiers that any misstep could be prosecuted under military law, then ordered Raymond to make sure all the soldiers, including the knights, understood that discipline was non-negotiable. Raymond immediately waved in agreement. Forces were deployed outside the city with tighter control. Then Yuri announced he'd meet Lord Jade himself at the palace. The governor welcomed him with a smile, expressing what an honor it was to meet the third prince of Betrayal. Yuri returned the greeting respectfully and thanked the governor on behalf of Betrayal for Jade's cooperation, but the governor said thanks weren't necessary and assured him Jade would fully support the coalition. As they sat, the governor praised Yuri's father for his battles against the orcs in his youth, and joked that the orcs must be trembling now with his son here. Yuri laughed lightly and said he'd try to live up to his expectations. A servant approached the governor and whispered in his ear, and the governor then told Yuri that the princess of the Holy Kingdom had just arrived and asked if he wanted to meet her. Yuri agreed immediately. Moments later, Princess Sibila entered the hall, accompanied by 2 knights. Her face was stern, with no trace of warmth. The governor stood and welcomed her. The princess gave Yuri a cold look and asked if he was one of the governor's attendants. Before he could answer, she dismissed him coolly, saying she had matters to discuss with the governor and asked him to leave. The governor grew flustered and tried to explain, but before he could finish, one of the princess's knights shouted at Yuri, calling him rude and demanding how he could sit before the royal family without standing. But Yuri, calmly and with a hint of amusement, revealed his identity. "I am the third prince of Betrayal." Silence fell over the hall and the princess and her soldiers froze. The knights who had insulted him quickly bowed, offering repeated apologies, but Yuri laughed and joked that it was his fault for dressing like a vagrant instead of a prince, which only made them more flustered. Later, while drinking tea, Yuri jokingly asked the governor if he really looked that shabby, and the governor laughed and said no. Princess Sibila then apologized for the misunderstanding and asked him to let it go. Yuri joked again, then offered a formal greeting, introducing himself and extending his hand for a handshake. Sibila shook his hand and responded politely, and he casually asked her age. Sibila was surprised but answered that she was 20. Yuri smiled and said he was 18, and that a 2-year difference didn't mean anything, so they could drop the formalities. The governor laughed and said it was good to build friendship before facing the orcs, then asked Sibila if she agreed, and she answered hesitantly, "It's fine. Again to Stong. If you get a make in Jallery." After the small talk ended, Yuri asked Sibila about her forces, and noted he hadn't seen any soldiers on the road. She confirmed they would arrive on the second day. Yuri put a hand to his chin thoughtfully, and said he hoped nothing bad happened to them. His comment annoyed her, and she answered sharply that order and discipline in the Holy Kingdom were nothing to worry about, then asked if he thought something had happened. He clarified he meant external threats, not internal ones, and explained that orcs sometimes crossed borders and set up ambushes without warning. The governor nodded in agreement, saying orcs were smarter than their size made them look. Yuri wrapped it up by saying he was confident the Holy Kingdom would handle it, but advised Sibila to stay alert. Later, while strolling through the city, Yuri talked with Hernando. When asked about the Holy Knights, Yuri said they were extremely stiff and old-fashioned, and it seemed the princess would have a hard time with them. Hernando asked if he liked the princess, and Yuri just shrugged and said, maybe. Then he pulled out the necklace he'd taken from the bandits and asked Hernando if he was sure it came from this area. Hernando confirmed it, pointing out that only one place sold things like that, and it was this market. Yuri asked if the bandit leader's claim that the necklace lured orcs was true. Hernando answered that the bandit chief said orcs went crazy when they sensed its aura, like it was a war drug, adding it might be a magical relic, but too crude to be effective. As they discussed it, the shop owner seemed to have had enough and shouted at them to leave if they weren't going to buy anything. So they left, and he said, maybe the bandits bought up all the stock. Yuri smiled and said, that was unfortunate. Suddenly, Hernando noticed something and called out to Yuri to look. They saw soldiers from Betrayal entering a building that looked like a gambling den. Hernando commented that betting was going on there. Yuri's eyes lit up with excitement, and he said he couldn't ignore it if his men were gambling. As they approached the tavern, Yuri remarked that discipline was essential, and Hernando agreed. Anyone overhearing them might think they were angels come down from heaven, but we, who have seen their past, know how many times they snuck off to play. Isn't that right, legends? Elsewhere in the city, a knight from the Holy Kingdom named Finnick, the deputy commander of Princess Sibila's forces, asked if she had met the Lord. She answered yes. Finnick mocked Yuri, saying he'd heard a rumor that the prestige of the Betrayal prince was in the gutter, and that he couldn't believe such an eccentric was in command, adding that the glory of Betrayal's knights was long gone. Sibila warned him not to insult Betrayal, but he ignored her, sneering at Yuri's clothes and behavior. She looked at him with disgust, but he kept provoking her, saying it wouldn't be surprising if Betrayal lost a prince at the first sign of danger. Finally, Sibila ordered him to stop, and he complied mockingly, saying, as you wish, Your Highness. She then asked if there were any problems with the main force, and he replied arrogantly that everything was under control before leaving, saying they would patrol the city. Sibila sighed with concern. That night, the city inn was buzzing with noise and drink. Finnick and his knights entered with grim faces, and he asked in disdain who those patrons were. One knight answered they looked like soldiers from Betrayal. Finnick scoffed at their lack of discipline, wondering how they were even allowed in. Another knight laughed and said their commander's behavior explained it well enough. Finnick declared he wouldn't tolerate this scene. He raised his voice, asking what the soldiers were doing there and if they thought they were on vacation. As they turned around with cards in their hands, his boring speech droned on, which no one wanted to hear, until he felt a hand pat his shoulder. He spun around and froze. It was our hero Yuri, smiling, his hand still on Finnick's shoulder. He asked his name, and Finnick's expression changed as he slapped Yuri's hand away, saying such an insulting act was an affront to him and his soldiers' reputation. The soldiers stared in shock while Finnick kept mocking them, saying they didn't deserve to be on the battlefield if they clung to playing cards like children. Yuri's smile faded, replaced by a cold look, and he demanded to know why he was being so disrespectful instead of answering a simple question. He then wondered if the Holy Kingdom had any respect for the chain of command in its military at all. Finnick tried to recover, but before he could speak, the door swung open and Princess Sibila walked in, asking what was going on. As soon as she saw Finnick, she frowned, reminding him he was supposed to be on patrol. His lofty tone vanished at once, and he bowed in apology, but Sibila ordered him to wait outside, and he obeyed, fuming inside. She turned to Yuri and apologized on Finnick's behalf. Yuri smiled and told her it wasn't necessary, then added with sarcasm, "Unless you're the king yourself, no one expects you to control every subordinate." Her hand instinctively went to her sword, then she turned around, and before leaving she said she would repay the favor another time. But as soon as she left, his face darkened. Raymond's words echoed in his mind, but he shrugged, muttering that it wasn't his business, then went back to join the soldiers for another round. They welcomed him with laughter and cheers, excited to play with their leader. Yuri laughed heartily and said, "Now that's good morale. And here I was thinking he really meant to discipline them." Outside, Finnick stood with arms crossed alongside his knights when the princess approached. Angry, he asked if she'd already become friends with the third prince of Betrayal. She cut him off sharply, asking if that was really what mattered right now. Finnick burst out angrily about the prince's lack of manners, but before he could say more, a panicked voice tore through the air. He and the princess turned together toward the source to find a soldier approaching on a horse soaked in blood. The soldier dismounted and fell to one knee, apologizing for his appearance before delivering urgent news. The Holy Kingdom's main force had been ambushed by orcs. The princess's face turned pale, but she steadied herself firmly. She donned her armor and mounted her horse. Sir Jade then asked anxiously if she planned to leave immediately. She waved in affirmation, but before she could depart, he suggested she request support from Betrayal's army, explaining it wasn't about pride, it was about reducing allied casualties. But Finnick exploded again, saying the Holy Kingdom didn't need help, and that the kingdom's affairs would be handled by the kingdom itself, asking if the Lord really believed their knights could be defeated by orcs. The Lord tried to calm things down, but the princess quietly cut in, reassuring him that she appreciated his concern but would handle it herself. Then she called her knights to advance, and they all rode out. Watching them go, he sighed with a kind of contentment. One of his soldiers commented on how stubborn the people of the Holy Kingdom were. The Lord replied, especially Vice Captain Finnick. Without delay, he ordered the soldier to head to Betrayal's camp and request aid from the third prince. The soldier saluted and rushed off as fast as he could. The Lord had ordered him to hurry since they had no time to waste. At the camp, Yuri received the message, and the moment he read it, worry spread across his face. Raymond asked what happened, and Yuri said the Holy Kingdom's main forces had been attacked and that Sir Jade was asking for their help. Raymond was surprised the request came from Jade, and not the kingdom itself. Yuri replied coolly that someone had been too stubborn to ask in person, then ordered Raymond to prepare to move. Yuri turned to the messenger and asked his name. The soldier panted, "My name is Roy." Yuri then ordered him to go to the tavern near the charm market and summon Betrayal's knights, adding that the prince would accept only the first 10 to arrive. Roy nodded quickly and rushed off, kicking up dust behind him. Yuri set the letter on the table and clapped his hands, mumbling with a sly smile, "Time for a night run." And when T-Devo, that night, Yuri rode out with his knights toward the indicated location. He turned to them jokingly, asking if they were still a bit drunk. The knights answered proudly, raising their swords into the air. Yuri laughed again at their enthusiasm, then glanced at Gerard and teased that he looked miserable. Gerard muttered that he was fine, though his appearance didn't say so. Then Laurand rode up on his gleaming horse and called out to the prince with a gentle joke. Yuri smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say to Laurent's admiration, then answered that he appreciated his loyalty as a knight under his wing. Inside, Yuri wondered when Laurand had become so devoted. It was a stark contrast to what he'd known about him in his previous life, though he admitted he himself had changed too. Laurent's face lit up, his eyes shining with gratitude toward the prince. As they advanced, Raymond called out, announcing he'd spotted something on the horizon. As they drew closer, they confirmed it was the Holy Kingdom's knights. Before engaging, Yuri addressed his men, reminding them this would be their first battle against orcs, and declared he would enter the battlefield first and be the last to leave. As he spoke, his body glowed with a pulsing blue aura. He swept his gaze over his forces and ordered, "Third Prince Yuri of Betrayal commands you all not to get hurt." Then he gripped his reins hard and gave the order to attack. In moments, the battlefield plunged into chaos. The princess cursed herself for being more reckless than she should have been. She admitted inwardly that she should have expected an ambush. Yuri's earlier warnings echoed in her mind, and she realized ignoring them had been a mistake she couldn't afford. Up front, huge shadows appeared in the battle fog, and as they drew near, their shapes became clearer. Her knights were fighting fiercely, surrounding each orc with several men. She felt relief when she saw the Holy Kingdom's banner still fluttering in the sky, then turned to Finnick and told him she would head directly for the enemy commander to take him out. Finnick received her order, then instructed the soldiers to form up and attack. The Knights of Light surged forward. The princess clutched her necklace, her voice trembling as she whispered a prayer, begging the ruler to grant them strength. Her horse began to glow with white light. She raised her sword and ordered a charge. As they advanced, they passed a skull stuck in the ground and covered in a silk-like web. The moment they approached it, the skull emitted a sinister purple aura, and suddenly a magic circle lit up beneath their horses, and the ground collapsed from under them. Before they could react, the knights fell one after another into the darkness. The princess realized she'd made the wrong call again. As she fell, her thoughts drifted to the past, to the moment she first received her sacred powers as a child. Congratulations surrounded her, and proud voices called her amazing. Determined to prove herself, she also sought to learn the arts of the sword. But on the day she broke her brother's sword blade, she realized she'd made her biggest mistake. Her brother felt his right to the throne was threatened, so he sent her to the battlefield. He spoke of heavenly will, and how fighting there would purify her soul. But she now knew he had lied. She lay on her back, aching and wounded, whispering that everything had been a trick, and that he had only wanted her dead. Around her, the injured soldiers struggled to stand. She ordered them to focus, but when she looked at her armor and sword, she saw a sticky black liquid clinging to them. Her face went pale. It was oil. She looked up to see orcs surrounding them, one of them holding a torch high. Her breath froze, and her thoughts began to collapse. A fire trap. What can I do now? How am I going to survive? Did I go through all that just to die like this? Suddenly, a sound boomed from afar. She opened her eyes to see an orc's head flying through the air. Then the voice came again, mocking. Is saying the words "help me" really that hard? Yuri stood atop the cliff, asked if she was okay, then threw her a rope. She grabbed it and climbed out. As soon as she stood beside him, she looked at him, saying she owed him and thanking him. What surprises did the future have in store for her? But before he could say more, Vice Captain Finnick stepped forward, his arrogance gone. He bowed to Yuri and addressed him formally, declaring that he saluted the third prince of Betrayal in the name of the Holy Kingdom, then offered a sincere apology for the earlier incident at the tavern, adding that he wouldn't forget this favor. Even the princess stared in shock, wondering, is Finnick actually apologizing? Yuri looked at him calmly. After a brief pause, he nodded and accepted the apology, adding that if Betrayal ever needed help, he hoped the Holy Kingdom would return the favor. Suddenly, shouting rang out nearby. Yuri turned quickly toward the sound to see an orc blowing a horn. He tightened his grip on his sword, but then noticed the orcs were beginning to retreat. He wondered if they were fleeing after failing to kill the Knights of Light. Without hesitation, he ordered his men to pursue and not let a single one escape. The soldiers cheered and charged forward, but as they fled, Yuri spotted something. An orc was carrying a distinctive banner. His eyes narrowed. He recognized it immediately. It was the orc commander, just as his mentor had told him. The princess called out to him, but he motioned for her to stay behind. The orc leader raised his bow, knocked an arrow infused with dark magic, and fired. Yuri focused and, in a flash, drew his sword and split the arrow in midair. He smirked and said, "Looks like the orc commander is mad at me. Guess I have no choice but to take the bait." We see Yuri laughing as he says, "It's obvious the orc commander is riled up because of him. Fine. Then, he should respond to the provocation now." Then he says to the princess that he'll be back in a bit. The princess is shocked and says, "Yuri, you're not planning to go alone, right?" He doesn't answer her and charges the orc commander with his sword. He thinks to himself that 5 years ago, in the past, Master Bernard tells Yuri that in battle, there are a million variables, terrain, weather, countless things. The core is to expand your capacity to act through repeated training. But, Your Highness, your soul sever is different. In an instant, you grasp everything happening around you, instinctively choose the optimal path, and turn that into a sword style. Yuri tells him he doesn't get it and asks him to explain more. Master Bernard says that when the time comes, he'll understand on his own. His body will move first in the right direction, allowing him to take down the enemy in the most effective way. In the present, Yuri unleashes his sword, cuts down an orc, and starts fighting them, but they get furious and begin charging him. He thinks to himself that being one man against 3 orcs, it's really risky to face them head-on like this. Even though it's been a long time since he was last on a battlefield, there's no way he's letting this chance slip. He can see it. The optimal sword strike. He slices through all the orcs in front of him, taking them all out with ease, then thinks to himself that his body still isn't catching up to his thoughts. Fine. For now, he'll accept that. Then he grabs a spear from the ground, lifts it high, and shouts at the top of his lungs for Orcval, the orc commander. We see the orc commander seething with rage, but suddenly our hero Yuri rushes him. Orcval blocks the strike with the axes in his hands. Our hero glances at the battle between the soldiers and the orcs, then thinks to himself, they've decided any more losses aren't worth it. Then he says loudly with a laugh that he hopes this is payback enough for the arrow he took earlier. The princess comes running up and asks if he's hurt. Yuri tells her no, he's fine. Anyway, it looks like it's pretty much over now, right? Then he asks, so, Sibila, how does your first victory with the allied forces feel? The princess says thank you, it was all thanks to him. We see a soldier talking to his buddies, and they don't believe him. He says, I'm telling you, yeah. Just like I said, His Highness rushed forward and snatched the torch that was thrown into the pit. The rumor said Prince Yuri's skills were weak, so I figured he was just a gambler funding himself with gambling money. A blonde, very handsome soldier tells him those were baseless rumors, and that he's sure His Majesty's blood runs in Prince Yuri in its strongest form. This won't do. Allow me to explain all of His Highness's achievements one by head. 1. Oh man, this guy is totally wasted. Who gave him booze? There's a girl in disguise sitting there, thinking to herself, Prince Yuri. It's so weird for him to be just another member of the royal family, and that intuition he has, being able to see through the assassination technique I've been hiding my whole life, and now he's even walking alone into a battlefield. No matter what mission he's given, he's always steps ahead. Sometimes I feel like he really knows the future. The girl calls out to the innkeeper and tells him she's looking for someone. The innkeeper asks who she's looking for. She says, a guy with dark brown hair, a sword at his hip, and he's really skilled with it. The innkeeper says, honestly, I can't think of anyone like that off the top of my head. So the girl says he's not good at the continent's language. He might have a strange accent. The innkeeper goes, now that you say that, I almost recognize him, but I'm not sure if his hair was really brown. But I do remember someone with a weird accent. He ordered risotto and asked for no spices. He's thinking of someone and says, and he also asked how to get to Balshad. The girl thanks him for the info and tries to give him money. He laughs and says, I wasn't telling you this to get a reward, but since you insist, thanks ma'am. The girl thinks to herself, Balshad? Huh, that's where the coalition forces are gathering. Looks like he's heading to the same place as His Highness. I need to move early and look for him. One of the top 10 on the continent. The swordsman from the east. We moved on to the next place, but on the way we had to pitch tents and camp for the night. We were really well prepared after learning from what happened before in the Holy Kingdom. Looks like everyone's gotten used to this. Work. I was worried I'd have to start explaining from the basics. Raymond says, we've set up camp at night several times before. Now their bodies know what to do on their own. Yuri says, Sir Raymond, it's all thanks to you. You did a great job. I'll do a round and look around. I'll leave management to you. Raymond says, of course, Your Majesty. It's quiet even though there are a lot of people around us. Maybe the chance of a night attack is higher than I expected, but then he's surprised to see 2 soldiers holding an orc and torturing him, and a soldier says, you little punk, didn't I tell you not to leave my sight? The second guard says, honestly, this orc is definitely a spy. He might be fooling His Majesty to do spy work. The orc says, no, that's not true. How could I even do that? It's not true at all. The guard grabs him and yanks off the gloves in his hand and says, not true, huh? You probably stole these too. The orc says, I didn't steal anything. Give them back. The guard says, I need to destroy them right now. Yuri steps in and says, you two over there, what are you doing here while everyone else is working to set up the camp? The guard says, Your Majesty, look, this guy, Yuri says, looks like my words aren't getting through, so I'll say it again, more nicely. Get out of my sight. The guards get scared and leave, and the hero says to the orc, you okay? The orc says, yeah, thank you, Your Majesty. Yuri says, want me to yell at them? The orc says, no, it's fine. People like nice things and hate bad things. It's a natural result. If you had helped me, I'd feel better right now, but that would only push me further away from my dream. I want to live among people after earning their recognition. Yuri thinks to himself, that's a tough dream. For now, he can stick with the soldiers under the pretense of being an orc language interpreter. But once this raid is over, Yuri pats him and says, Corey, you're with Hernando now, right? The orc says, yeah. Yuri says, learn some magic from him. You'll need special skills if you want to live among people. You know that. At night in the camp, specifically in Yuri's tent, he says, how far are the preparations for a night attack? One of the commanders says, we covered all the supply depots with fire-resistant cloth to protect them from fire, and we also placed guards around the walls and camps. The second commander says, but do we really need to go that far? You also deployed more soldiers than usual. Yuri says, we're in orc territory after all. It wouldn't be strange if anything happened. There's a good chance they'll use fire attacks again like they did last time with the Holy Kingdom. He doesn't even finish talking when a soldier rushes in shouting, Your Majesty, urgent news. The orcs have attacked. The commanders all move and rush out of the tent, and they see orcs slaughtering the soldiers and attacking with fire. The royal mage Hernando says, the situation is worse than I imagined. Yuri says, I have no words. Do they have gunpowder now? Hernando says, that's not gunpowder, that's distorted mana magic. Yuri says, honestly, that's pretty obvious. I don't even know what to say, I'm fed up. Hernando, what's our plan to handle this? Hernando says, they might be throwing bombs prepped with magic. If that's the case, we need to stop the kids throwing them. A soldier arrives and says, Sir Raymond, split up and each take your unit. Hernando says, in the meantime, I'll go check the face of the brat behind this flashy show. Yuri says, hey Hernando, where's that magic coming from? Hernando says, from over there, I'll go and be right back. Then we see Orcval, the orc leader, coming in with the other orcs. The hero is shocked and Orcval charges at him. Our hero dodges the attacks, then thinks to himself, this orc is insanely strong, and his movements, totally unusual. He's clearly got a lot of combat experience. I don't like this, but I've got to keep some distance at first. Orcval attacks with tremendous force, but the hero manages to dodge it. Then Yuri stops and thinks, honestly, I'll admit it, you're on a totally different level than the others. Fine then, show me what you've got. A fierce battle starts between the two. Yuri dodges all of Orcval's attacks, but then Orcval goes in again. Yuri thinks to himself, mana method. I should have caught on to that as soon as I heard they could use magic. If an orc mage can use mana. Yuri asks Hernando, are they working with gunpowder now? Hernando says, that's not gunpowder, that's twisted mana magic. Yuri thinks, that means orc warriors can use the mana method too. Yuri says, so you're one of the special units, right? Yuri activates soul-cutting power. Then he grabs his sword and thrusts it into Orcval's neck, and thinks, this orc. He focused his mana on his neck to reduce the damage. Suddenly the orc grabs the sword, but our hero manages to cut off his hand. Then he attacks again, but the orc lands a hit on the hero's neck. But our hero breaks Orcval's weapon, suddenly raises his own weapon overhead, brings it down, pierces Orcval's head, and finishes him off. He steps on his body, then is shocked and thinks, he's still alive. He's one of the elite, so he might know more than the others. Killing him now would be a waste. The soldiers arrive and check on the hero, and he checks on the camp. They tell him they finished off most of the enemies. Yuri says, good, gather all the remaining orcs in one place, and bring this one too. From now on, we're going to start interrogating the orcs. We see Hernando and Yuri in the camp. Hernando is treating Yuri and says, the shoulder is an easy part of the body to injure. You have to heal it and protect it regularly to prevent any injury. Yuri says, you know, that was still from the orc just now. Anyway, stop talking so much. Hernando says, oh, so an orc can hit you like that, huh? He finishes his magic and says, done. Thankfully, nothing serious. Yuri says, great. Now, he doesn't finish because Hernando cuts him off, then says, yes, your highness. One moment. You there, guard. Bring that here. He brings him a heavy-duty field commander's chair. Our hero can't believe his eyes. Hernando says, a commander must always be imposing. Got it? One of our soldiers turned out to be a carpenter, so we put him to work. Yuri says, fine. Since you already made it, I can't refuse it just like that. And it's not bad at all. Now I'll start interrogating the prisoners. Bring them to me one by one. After a bit, we see our hero starting to finish them off one by one, and the rest are terrified. Then he says to one of them, you've got one chance to answer right. Who ordered the night ambush? The orc gets angry and talks. Corey says to our hero, your highness. This orc says, Yuri says, don't worry about it. I can tell it's just an insult. Then the knight Jared steps up, grabs the orc, finishes him, and burns him. Our hero gathers power in his sword, releases it at him, and finishes him off. Then he says, for the rest of you, I'll ask each of you only once, and depending on your answer, I might consider ending your lives without torture. He calls out to Jared and asks him to put that orc aside. One of the orcs speaks, and Corey translates. He says they don't know anything because they're just soldiers, but the one who ordered them was Orcval. So they're asking you to leave them alone and punish Orcval instead. Our hero laughs and says, so this attack was ordered by Okua? I've never heard that name before. We learn that Okua, the Orc King, is the reason this coalition was formed, and he's also the orc who killed many knights in Yuri's previous life. Without a doubt, he's the one who needs to be removed from this war at any cost. Corey says to Yuri, he's asking if you'll leave him alone if he answers honestly. Yuri says, tell him I will. Corey does so. then says to our hero, "Your Majesty, Orcval is asking for your oath." He says breaking an oath and attacking your opponent would drag your honor through the mud. Yuri says, seems like he's dealt with humans a lot before. Weird that an orc who only follows strength would say something like that. Alright, I'll swear. Knight Jared says, "Your Majesty, what will you do after you release him?" So Yuri says, "No problem, Jared. Calm down. Was this attack ordered by Okua?" He confirmed that it really was. More precisely, his tribe's chief passed down the order after he got it from Okua. What about the coalition forces? How did you figure out our route? And Curry says, he says Okua has a way to get information, but he doesn't know how. So Jared says, "Hold on, Your Majesty. That means the orc named Okua found out our route somehow and ordered the ambush, right?" Yuri says, "Yeah, and he probably pulled the same move in the Holy Kingdom incident." Orcval, one last question. Okua, how strong is he? Curry says, he says even if there were dozens of Orcval like him, they wouldn't stand a chance against him. He's sure Okua is stronger and fiercer than any being in this world. Yui says, "Yeah, that could be true, but I think you should still be careful." And the orc says, "I know. Humans are way fiercer and craftier, more than you can imagine." Yui says, "You want to fight? I was planning to keep the oath. Damn, look at him. He's charging right at me." The guards all ready their weapons. The orc charges at our hero, and Jared readies his weapon and says, "What a shame. And you have the nerve to talk about honor. Sadly, you're not worthy of that honor." To all the shodder and told venture about they've around. And then our hero leaves them and walks away, letting them finish him off. We see someone named Germain, a priest of Betrayal, treating our hero. He says, "Please, let it all be over soon. Priest, please, take a look here too." Germain says, "Yeah, I'm coming right away." Hernando says, "Priest, take care of the patient over there first. I'll handle things here." Curry says, "Priest, I brought some water." Germain says, "Nice work, Curry. Now step back a little." Then Germain thinks to himself, it was just normal water, but after his spells, I felt a strange aura coming from the water. Then he tells Curry, "Use this water to clean their wounds. It's holy water. It'll clean their wounds." Curry sits using the water and thinks, strange. As soon as the priest started using magic, the faces of the upset people quickly calmed down. After a bit, Hernando sits with Curry and Germain and says, "Looks like things have calmed down a little for now." Germain says, "Thanks for your help, Sir Hernando." Hernando tells Curry, "You did good work too, Curry." Curry says, "No, not really. I didn't do anything big." Priest Germain says, "Good thing the losses didn't get worse than this." Hernando says, "That's because this is still before the real battle." Priest Germain says, "For sure, much worse things are going to happen later in the battle. God protect us." Hernando says, "But I don't think the operation will be that bad. Not that much." Priest Germain is really surprised. Hernando says, "Look, even though we just got through a very dangerous battle, people are helping each other, tending to each other's wounds, and our magic." He makes the sky look stunning and says, "Can only give a small bit of strength to these people's hearts." And this mensative like from the ride, he saw the snot was very place from the serve to the bowder and tildram. Curry says, "Sir Hernando, please, teach me magic." Hernando says, "Curry, what made you suddenly want to learn magic?" Curry says, "His Highness suggested the idea to me, and, because magic makes people smile, I want to be able to do exactly the same as them." Hernando says, "Yeah, a half-orc using magic for people, right? That would be really awesome." It's Owe. Morning. A guard comes and says to Yuri, "Your Highness." Yuri says, "What's wrong? What is it?" The guard says, "The kingdom's knights came to visit. They say they want to meet you." Jared says, "Are you going to meet them?" Yuri says, "I have to. Looks like they came specifically to see me since Belshad is right ahead of us. Bring them here." The commander of the kingdom's guards arrives and says, "Yes, it's an honor to meet you, the third prince of the kingdom of Betrayal. I am the knight and son of Count Zenon II, Rabio Artem, Your Majesty." Our hero says, "Welcome. Did the Empire reach Belshad before us?" Rabio says, "Yeah, we're the Vanguard Knights. We confirmed there are orcs around Belshad, so we're relaying the info to all units in the area." Our hero says, "And the knight behind you, who is he?" The knight removes his helmet and says, "Ah, right. Sorry, I didn't greet you first. Unfortunately, I'm not in an honorable position right now." Our hero thinks, "So we meet again like this, a symbol from my past that I wanted to forget. Graham Hartful. That knight is the Empire's knight, Graham Hartful." Then he says to our hero, "I'm Graham, stripped of the knight's title. I pay my respects to the third prince of the kingdom of Betrayal." Our hero thinks, "In my past life, I had to beg you to spare me, to save my life." Then he says, "Pleasure to meet you, Sir Graham." Graham says, "Please don't call me by those titles. I'm not a knight now." Our hero says, "If you're saying you lost your title, then you're fighting in this war without any title?" Graham says, "Yeah, even though it's embarrassing. Rabio speaks up and says, Sir Graham, you didn't do anything wrong. You just ended up under the wrong commander. I mean, am I wrong? There aren't other knights as renowned as you. Yuri thinks, I heard Graham lost his knight title for a certain reason from the Empire. I never imagined I'd meet him like this in the coalition forces, but the man who was cleaner and more honorable than any knight I'd known before is now, doubting himself and his fellow knights. Then he says, yeah, I've heard a lot about you, Sir Graham. It's an honor to meet you. Graham says, you don't have to flatter me that much. Yuri says, and that's why I've been wanting to ask you, Sir Graham, how about coming to Betrayal?